Think your morning breath is bad. In medieval times, they didn't even brush their teeth. No mint, no toothpaste, just rot twigs and prayer. Ready to find out how they survived. Think you've got bad breath? Try medieval breath. It didn't just clear rooms, it cleared villages. One exhale and crops failed, priests wept and marriages ended. You brush your teeth twice a day. How quaint. Medieval peasants didn't even know teeth could be cleaned. They just assumed your mouth rotted like your soul, inevitable, tragic and vaguely poetic. Imagine waking up in a thatch roof hut next to a snoring spouse whose molars haven't seen a single cleaning since birth. You turn to whisper sweet nothings, but instead inhale a full medieval breakfast, rotting onions, goat fat, and last week's mead belch. There is no mint, no rinse, just vibes. The air inside that mouth could kill a small mammal. And yet they kissed, they flirted, they procreated. Love, as they say, is blind and nose dead. Medieval mouths were biological crime scenes, a festering buffet for bacteria. Every cavity was a confession, every molar a little tombstone. No one flossed, no one rinsed. Most didn't even know how many teeth they had because half were already gone by 25. Teeth were treated like soldiers in battle, brave, disposable, and mostly missing. There were no toothbrushes. Not a single medieval drawer held a bamboo brush with eco-friendly bristles. Instead, you might find a twig. Maybe chewed a bit, maybe dipped in ashes. But brushing wasn't the goal, survival was. Cleaning teeth was like cleaning your battlefield wounds, nice in theory, useless in practice, and rarely done before death. And here's the kicker. People didn't care. Not because they were too busy, but because they didn't even register tooth decay as a problem. Pain was normal. Gum disease. Just another Tuesday. If your tooth throbbed, you prayed harder. If it bled well, maybe God was mad. The body was a prison, and the mouth was solitary confinement. Let's talk numbers. The average medieval person had a full set of adult teeth by age 12. By age 30, that set looked like a haunted graveyard. Historians have studied skulls from the era and found cavities so deep you could park a cart in them. One woman's remains showed a molar with a hole down to the jawbone, and she lived with it for years. Tooth pain was not a crisis, it was character building. Now think about modern times. You feel a twinge in your gum and panic like it's the end of the world. You book a same-day appointment, ask for numbing gel, and complain about the trauma for a week. Meanwhile, medieval folks had molars crack in half during dinner and simply picked out the pieces. Maybe used it as a charm, maybe swallowed it. No one's sure. No one asked. What makes this so brilliant, by which I mean horrifying, is how they explained it. See, they didn't know about bacteria, or plaque, or enamel erosion. What they did believe in was balance, humours. Not the funny kind, although irony abounds. If your tooth hurt, it meant your body's fluids were having a civil war. Blood phlegm, black bile, yellow bile, all taking sides. Your tooth just collateral damage. In some cases, they blamed it on air. Literally. Bad air entered the mouth, corrupted the teeth, and stayed there like an unpaying tenant. So instead of brushing, they tried to purge it. How? With herbs, smoke, or prayers. Yes, prayers. If your toothache got worse, it meant your soul was being purified. So now you're in pain and grateful. That's medieval optimism for you. Now let's zoom in on a real case. A 14th century monk in Paris wrote about his tooth pain in his diary because that's what monks did. He described a gnawing demon inside his jaw. Spoiler, it was an abscess. But instead of seeking help, he fasted and meditated. For 2 weeks. By day 10, the swelling had closed one eye. By day 14, the pain moved to the heavens. Translation, he died. Holy enlightenment achieved via oral sepsis. But hey, it wasn't all suffering. Sometimes your teeth just fell out. No pain, no warning, just plink onto the floor. People wore them like charms. Some strung them into necklaces. Others buried them under the hearth to keep evil spirits away. In one documented case, a woman in Norwich swallowed a loose tooth during labour. The midwife called it a blessing. The child later died. Coincidence? No. Just medieval logic. The lack of concern was cultural. In a society where half your neighbours died of plague and the other half from sword wounds, a little tooth pain didn't rank high. Priorities were different. Hygiene was barely a concept. Your mouth might reek, but so did everything else. You were surrounded by rotting meat, dung-filled streets and dying livestock. Honestly, a mouthful of decay just added to the ambience. But what about royalty? Surely the kings and queens had better dental care, you sweet summer child. If anything, it was worse. Nobility had access to sugar and exotic, expensive delight from the East, and they used it like toddlers on Halloween. Candied fruit, sugared meats, honey-glazed everything. It wrecked their teeth faster than you could say divine right to gum disease. Queen Elizabeth, though, famously had blackened teeth. So black in fact that it became fashionable. Courtiers painted their teeth darker to match hers. This is not a joke. Having a rotting smile became a status symbol. Imagine living in a time where your mouth falling apart was considered chic. Now imagine the smell, and then imagine dinner. Still hungry? Let's not forget the children. Poor little mouth monsters. They had baby teeth come in rot out, and adult teeth arrive to immediately start the decay cycle. No brushing, no rinsing, just rot, repeat, and pray. Some cultures believed the devil lived in children's mouths. Others just blamed mothers. Either way, the kid ends up toothless by 15 and dead by 30. Circle of medieval life. And if you're thinking, well, maybe they chewed herbs or something, congratulations, you've read one article on ancient practices. Yes, they sometimes chewed parsley, but not to clean teeth. To mask odour before a meeting. It's like spraying perfume on a corpse. Smells better still dead. Let's close this lovely dental tour with one last image. Picture a medieval skeleton dug up in a quiet English field. The jaws cracked. The molars are worn to nubs. One incisor is lodged sideways, pressing into the skull. There's a hole where an abscess drained through the bone, and historians believe, based on wear patterns, that this person died chewing, through pain, through decay, through centuries of dental darkness. So next time you gag while flossing, remember you're living in the golden age of teeth. You have electric brushes, flavoured paste, gentle hygienists and anaesthesia. Medieval people had stick superstition and screaming. Your mouth is not a crime scene. It's a luxury condo. Maintain it. And whisper thank you to your dentist. Or at least stop ghosting them. Bad breath today is an inconvenience. Bad breath in medieval times was a lifestyle. It didn't just linger, it entered rooms before you did. A person could clear out a tavern not by fighting, but by speaking. One hello, and the ale soured. Halitosis wasn't a medical issue, it was part of your identity, like being left-handed, or mildly cursed. There was no shame in it because there was no escape from it. Everyone's mouth was a festering cave of misery. Peasants, priests, kings, it didn't matter. Your tongue was basically a sponge soaked in rot. Kissing someone was an act of war, a slow, intimate chemical attack. Historians have analysed dental remains from medieval graves. The findings are consistent enamel worn down, exposed pulp abscesses that could swallow a cherry pit. One poor soul was found with a molar split in half vertically. It wasn't removed. It wasn't treated. He just lived like that, probably biting into barley bread with a tooth shaped like a canyon. And while we're here, let's talk about the bread. Because bread was the backbone of medieval diets and a dental assassin. You think carbs are bad for your waistline, medieval bread was worse for your skull. They ground grain using millstones made of stone, obviously, which meant tiny particles of grit ended up in the flour. Every bite was like chewing edible sandpaper. Daily life was like flossing with gravel. Over time, this eroded enamel until your teeth looked like worn-down mountains. That pain in your gum, it wasn't a cavity. It was the bread fighting back. Some people lost teeth just from eating porridge. Porridge, that's like losing a toe to a pillow fight. But people kept eating because they had to. And because pain wasn't optional, it was normal. Pain was how you knew you were still alive. If your jaw throbbed and your face swelled, you didn't panic. You tightened your cloak and went to work. Maybe you sucked on a cold iron spoon for relief, or bit a piece of wood and hoped your body figured it out. The sheer frequency of tooth loss is astonishing. 1 in 5 adults had fewer than 10 teeth by middle age, and not because of clean extractions. Teeth just fell out, like bad roommates who couldn't take it anymore. Some came out in bits, others stayed halfway embedded, rotting like forgotten fruit at the bottom of a basket. And yet here's the kicker: people often kept their fallen teeth as souvenirs, as amulets, as heirlooms. One account tells of a mother who kept her husband's molar in a pouch and kissed it every night. Romance wasn't dead, it just had a strong aftertaste. By now you're probably asking, why didn't they do something about it? The answer: they didn't know they could. The very concept of dental hygiene as a thing didn't exist. The idea that brushing might prevent problems was as foreign to them as Wi-Fi or gluten-free muffins. They didn't know what plaque was. They didn't know bacteria existed. They thought your teeth rotted because of sin or bad luck or the phases of the moon. One 12th century manuscript suggests avoiding eel meat to prevent toothaches. Not sugar, not poor hygiene, just eels. Another swore that sleeping with your mouth open let the devil sneak in and chew on your molars. That's why some monks tied their jaws shut at night. Not for silence, for demonic dental protection. Even the educated elite had no clue. Medieval physicians were more likely to prescribe leeches for a toothache than actual care. One remedy involved boiling a frog and holding its warm body to your cheek. Did it help? No. But it made you forget about the pain out of sheer confusion. Meanwhile, the odour coming from people's mouths could probably be measured in visible waves. Chronic halitosis wasn't the exception, it was the default setting. There's even documentation of a bishop who refused to speak indoors because his breath offended the angels. That's right. His breath was so bad it violated divine regulations. People got creative. They chewed cloves. Not to clean the teeth, mind you, just to not make each other faint. They burned rosemary and inhaled the smoke. They rubbed ashes on their tongues. Some kissed with mouthfuls of mint in their cheeks. Imagine dating with that kind of strategy, darling, I love you. Please accept this mouth leaf as a sign of my enduring affection. But even cloves couldn't cover everything. Because when infection took hold, real infection, it didn't stop at bad breath. It meant pus. It meant your face swelling into shapes found in nightmares. Dental abscesses routinely spread into the neck, the bloodstream, and the brain. One man in Italy died after a molar infection caused his tongue to swell and block his airway. His cause of death was listed as divine will. Nope, just oral bacteria and zero dental care. And it wasn't just the pain or smell, it was the sound. When people chewed, their jaws clicked. When they spoke, molars cracked. Some chewed only on one side because the other half was too decayed to handle soft food. A banquet sounded less like dining and more like a pile of bones collapsing under stress. There was no escape. No age group was spared. Children had cavities by age 7. By 12, they were already losing teeth. By 25, they were gumming their gruel and asking the priest if Jesus had gingivitis. In fact, some thought tooth pain was holy suffering proof that God hadn't forgotten you. But here's the truly depressing twist: people didn't know how much better it could be. There was no golden era of oral care to look back on. They thought the human body was supposed to rot this way. They didn't think about prevention because no one had shown them another option. A world where teeth stayed clean was as mythical as dragons or debt-free landlords. Which brings us to the most ironic part of all: some people did live longer. Monks, for example, had slightly better dental health. Why less sugar? Simpler diets. More time to chew slowly and not get stabbed. And when they died, their skulls often showed fewer cavities. The takeaway prayer didn't help your soul, but it was great for your teeth. And now you, the modern reader, are sipping coffee and scheduling dental cleanings every 6 months. You own a $300 toothbrush that sings lullabies. You complain when your whitening strip stings for 3 seconds. Meanwhile, your ancestors were swallowing their own teeth and calling it a Tuesday. So the next time you gag, brushing your tongue, or scream about a sore wisdom tooth, remember you are living in a time where your mouth is a priority, not a prison. You have floss. They had frogs. You have anesthesia. They had faith. You have options. They had rot. And honestly, you don't even say thank you. You ever floss too hard and see a little blood and go, oh no, am I dying? Cute. Adorable. A medieval peasant would see your bleeding gum and assume you were doing great. Back then, if your mouth wasn't gushing something red, yellow, or unidentifiable, you were probably already dead. Bleeding gums were as common as dirt. In fact, some folks probably thought it was normal, like morning dew, but for your mouth. The gums of medieval Europe were a battleground. Every meal was a siege. Bread hard enough to chip a stone. Meat. Usually old, salted to oblivion and chewier than a boot. Vegetables. If you were lucky enough to have them, they came unwashed, complete with soil and possibly a few bugs. The mouth didn't digest, it fought for survival. Gingivitis. That's a modern word for an ancient horror. In the Middle Ages, inflamed gums weren't something you treated. They were something you tolerated, like fleas, or that one cousin who never left your home. Red, swollen, pus-leaking gums were just a phase. Like puberty, except more painful and without the acne to distract you. Pus in the mouth wasn't cause for concern, it was practically a condiment. Imagine chewing with open sores, layers of plaque thicker than your neighbour's moral compass, and gums that bled if you even thought about smiling. Kissing someone was a gamble. One bad smooch, and you'd end up sharing not just affection, but bacteria, and whatever festering mouth soup they'd been brewing for weeks. And here's the thing, they thought this was sexy. Well, not the pus part, but rosy gums that were seen as healthy. The redness of inflammation was misread as vitality, kind of like mistaking a car crash for dramatic parking. There are love poems from the time comparing a lady's lips to blood and a knight's mouth to fire. Spoiler that fire was infection, and it was spreading. But hey, if it got worse, there was always the barber. You know, the guy who cut your hair, pulled your teeth, and occasionally amputated your leg, all with the same set of tools. He'd lean you back, say a prayer, and go digging. No anesthesia, no disinfectant, just bravery, brute strength, and probably wine. Lots and lots of wine. Of course, none of that fixed the gums. If anything, it made them worse. Gums didn't heal under medieval conditions, they festered, they stank, and eventually they gave up entirely. Teeth loosened like bricks in bad mortar and fell out during meals. Some people swallowed them. Others kept them in pouches, possibly for good luck, possibly because they didn't know what else to do. If you had periodontitis, the kind of gum disease that makes your teeth look like they're trying to escape, you were just another member of the unspoken club, the Soft Jaw Club. Members included merchants, monks, mothers, and murderers. Anyone who had the bad luck of surviving into their 30s with teeth still hanging on. They didn't discuss it. They just gummed their way through life and pretended it was fine. And here's a real gem, there were zero tools to help with this. No mouthwash, no antiseptics, not even saltwater rinses unless you lived near the coast and were really, really desperate. The most common treatment was to rub crushed herbs on the gums. Sage, mint, thyme. Smelled nice, did nothing. It was like spraying perfume on a compost bin. In some regions, bloodletting was the preferred solution. That's right. Gums bleeding too much, time to bleed more. Doctors would slice open your arms or legs to balance the humours. Because obviously the mouth is connected to your ankle blood. This wasn't medicine. This was chaos in a robe. And women. Oh, they got it worse. as always. Female dental pain was often dismissed as hysteria. A wife complains her mouth is rotting. She's probably just sad her cow died, or possessed. Either way, she needs a priest, not a poultice. One account tells of a nun who was banned from prayer for screaming during meals. Turns out her gums had receded so far her jawbone was exposed. But silence is holiness, right? Now let's pivot to the knights, the supposed pinnacle of health and chivalry. These men wore chainmail, fought dragons, or at least angry farmers, and were revered across the land. You'd expect dazzling smiles. Instead, their mouths looked like collapsed mines. Years of hard bread, no hygiene, and endless mead rotted their gums to filth. Some knights refused helmets not out of bravery, but because the pressure made their mouths bleed. Honour through oral agony. In religious communities, monks sometimes attempted cleanliness rituals. These included rinsing with wine or vinegar and gently scraping teeth with metal picks. Sounds civilized, right? Except the metal wasn't sterilized. The wine was sour, and the scraping often led to infections that made everything worse. Some monasteries even banned tooth rituals during fasting periods, because vanity was a sin but gurgling blood, totally fine. And let's not forget the bizarre belief that tooth pain purified the soul. If your gums bled, it meant your sins were leaking out. That's right, your gingivitis was divine judgment, which meant the worse your gums, the holier you probably were. There's even a saint rumoured to have refused treatment for her swollen gums as an offering to God. She died young, but hey, what a pious death. Of course not everyone bought into the theology of tooth misery. In more progressive areas, aka places where they had access to basic trade routes, there were travelling toothmen. These weren't dentists. They were more like dental conmen. They promised to heal your mouth with potions made of burnt bread pig fat or powdered deer antler. Results varied, but most included vomiting diarrhea and a complete loss of faith in humanity. Still, people tried. Because medieval mouths weren't just about eating, they were about surviving. A strong jaw meant you could chew meat. Chew meat, you stayed strong. Stay strong, you didn't die from famine or warfare. In that sense, your gums were part of your survival gear, like boots or a sword or a good lie to the tax collector. But as the centuries rolled on, even the bloodiest gums couldn't be ignored. Scholars began to write tentative theories about tooth rot. Some even guessed that sugary foods played a role because nobles who ate more sweets had worse teeth. Brilliant deduction, Captain Obvious. Unfortunately, this idea didn't trickle down to the masses until centuries later. Until then, more blood, more glory. So the next time you spit a little pink into the sink and panic, remember, medieval people bled from their gums every day and still went to church, fought wars and raised children who probably had 6 teeth total. You are not suffering. You're living in a dental utopia, a place where your gums are pink firm and not quietly rotting from the inside out. And if that doesn't make you brush tonight, nothing will. Ah, yes, the rich. The landowners, the nobles, the crown-bedecked influencers of medieval Europe. Surely they had better teeth, right? Better food, better care, maybe a magical scroll that whispered flossing techniques in Latin. Nope. Plot twist the richer. You were the blacker your teeth. Decay wasn't a disease, it was a flex. See, sugar was the real villain here, not the occasional honey you scrape from a beehive with a stick. We're talking mountains of sugar imported from far-off lands, carried across seas, then dumped into the goblets of Europe's elite like powdered gold. The poor didn't have it. They gnawed on barley and regretted nothing. But the nobles, they feasted on sugar like toddlers in a locked pantry, and it rotted their mouths faster than a medieval execution. Queen Elizabeth of Yum is the poster child for this phenomenon. Her teeth were so blackened by sugar and decay that foreign diplomats noted it in letters home. Not her political prowess, not her fashion, her dental rot. And here's the kicker. Ladies of the court started painting their teeth to match hers. That's right. Black teeth became a status symbol. Want to look rich? Paint your mouth like a rotting crypt. Now imagine a party in the court of Henry VIII. Gold goblets, clinking lute music floating, and across the table, dozens of smiles that look like burnt toast. You're trying to flirt, but your date's front teeth resemble coal bricks. Charming. And yet this was elegant, sophisticated. A mouldy grin meant you could afford to destroy your body slowly. Meanwhile, peasants in the fields, those mud-covered, oat-munching, illiterate souls, had better teeth. Not because they were smarter, because they were poorer. Their diet was brutal, but simple grains, vegetables, legumes, sometimes meat that smelled suspicious. But it wasn't soaked in sugar. Their teeth eroded from grit, not sweetness. Functional decay, not decorative. But the upper crust didn't just stop at sugar. They layered their decay with other indulgences. Candied violets, honeyed dates, preserved fruits and syrup, so thick you could use it as mortar. Every meal was a dental apocalypse in slow motion. Molars cracked, gums swelled, jaws rotted, but dinner exquisite. You'd think with all that money they'd develop better dental tools. Think again. Most noble houses had no designated tooth care whatsoever. You might find a silver pick used for nudging food out of crevices, but that's about it. Toothbrushes were rare exotic, and about as effective as brushing your teeth with a turkey feather dipped in hope. Mouth rinses occasionally whine, not for cleaning, just to numb the pain. The pain was constant. Nobles developed a high tolerance. Imagine smiling through a feast with an abscess the size of a pigeon egg pulsing in your cheek. One duke reportedly carried cloves sewn into a silk pouch around his neck, his version of medieval mouthwash. If the smell of rot was overwhelming, he'd breathe through the cloves and continue debating trade agreements, while quietly rotting from the gums outward. Let's not forget the ultimate irony: the church often praised noble suffering. If a peasant lost teeth, it was seen as misfortune. If a lord lost teeth, it was framed as spiritual sacrifice. One bishop had such extensive rot that he mumbled every sermon, but his flock believed it made his words more sacred. He wasn't stuttering, he was sanctified. Sometimes wealthy people would try folk remedies passed down from older servants. One involved rubbing crushed pearls on the teeth because of course it did. If something's expensive, it must work. Pearls on already infected gums. That's not hygiene. That's self-inflicted punishment with a garnish of privilege. Even the royal apothecary's early versions of pharmacists had no clue. Their cures included rubbing charcoal mixed with rose oil onto the gums, stuffing herbs under the tongue, and using powdered coral as a whitener. Yes, coral. Because what's better for your fragile, inflamed mouth than ground-up skeletons from the sea? And when the pain got too unbearable, there was always extraction. You didn't go to a trained professional. You called in the barber surgeon, or if you were fancy, a visiting tooth drawer. He came with tools that looked suspiciously like fireplace tongs in the bedside manner of a warhorse. You sat in a chair, someone held your arms, and he yanked. If you screamed, it was normal. If you passed out, even better, it meant fewer complaints. Some noble families, ashamed of their blackened stumps, started hiring artists to paint portraits with closed mouths. Go ahead, look at the paintings. Regal stoic, all lips sealed. It's not composure, it's shame. It's aristocrats trying to hide the gaping void where their molars used to be. But of course there were outliers. A few nobles actually tried to keep their mouths in shape. We have records of one duchess who rinsed daily with sage water and chewed fennel seeds. She lived to 63 and reportedly kept most of her teeth. Her peers assumed witchcraft or necromancy, or worse, peasant blood. And lest we forget the marriages. Nothing sealed a diplomatic union like a wedding kiss between two people with teeth like broken gravestones. There's an account of a French noblewoman fainting during her wedding because her husband's breath was like fire and vinegar. She recovered, gave birth to 6 children, and lived a life of quiet horror. Love in medieval terms was just endurance with better titles. Now imagine the smells. One noble chronicler described a king's breath as sourer than spoiled wine with the heat of summer stables. And that man had advisers. A court. People whose job was to get close and whisper secrets. Imagine plotting against an empire while breathing in decades of dental decomposition. It's a miracle the kingdom didn't fall from sheer olfactory trauma. Still, the rot was prestigious. It meant you weren't starving. You could afford exotic imports that destroyed your insides. You could throw banquets with courses so sweet they made your guests weep and their molars flee in protest. Your decay wasn't tragic. It was earned. So what did the rich do when it all got too much dentures? Not the plastic kind. Wooden, ivory, or even wait for it, human teeth stolen from corpses. Grave robbing was a legitimate side hustle. Dentures weren't for smiling, they were for status. You'd rather wear a stranger's smile than be seen gumming your roast swan at the feast. It all comes back to this: in the Middle Ages, decay wasn't just a condition. It was a statement. And the rich made it loudly, proudly, and with breath that could flatten livestock. So next time you see a celebrity's perfect white veneers and roll your eyes, remember their medieval equivalent had black teeth, a pocket full of cloves, and probably a stolen jawbone from a peasant buried in unholy soil. And they called it elegance. You've heard of wisdom teeth. You've heard of cavities. But have you heard of toothworms? No, this isn't a metaphor. Medieval people genuinely believed that tiny squirming creatures lived inside your teeth and caused pain by dancing, biting, or throwing microscopic parties. Imagine blaming your toothache on a worm doing the Macarena in your molar. That was science, at least medieval style. This belief wasn't fringe, it was mainstream. It spanned continents and cultures from Europe to the Middle East to parts of Asia. Everyone was united under one shared nightmare: your mouth was worm-infested. Some believed the worms were born from rotting food particles. Others thought they were placed there by the devil. Either way, if your tooth hurt, it wasn't because of infection, it was because something was living in you. The logic was in its own twisted way brilliant. Worms caused pain in fruit. Worms caused pain in wood. So naturally the same must apply to teeth. Your molar wasn't infected, it was infested. Dentists. No such thing. Exorcists suddenly very relevant. One German text from the 14th century describes worms as grey, speckled and long like small eels, as if someone had done a dental dissection and found a spaghetti dinner. So what did they do about these imaginary invaders? Oh, buckle up. Treatments included heating herbs and spices, blowing smoke into the mouth, or my personal favourite, pouring burning oil directly onto the tooth. The idea: smoke the worm out. Literally. If you screamed, it was working. If you passed out, even better. One less patient to worry about. There were also toothworm spells. Yes, magic. These weren't whispered nonsense, they were chanted with full sincerity, often by people who wore robes and had titles like healer or church elder. One Old English charm involves chanting against toothache and against the toothworm. I charm you, worm, that you may fall out of the tooth. Then you'd spit 3 times, ideally not on the healer. Job done. Worm banished. Pain. Probably worse. Still, some folks swore these rituals worked. Why? Because sometimes the pain did go away temporarily. A rotting nerve might finally die. The abscess might drain. The worm spell gets the credit. The rot gets a breather. And suddenly Grandma's garlic incantation is a family heirloom. Confirmation bias, the only thing stronger than plague immunity in medieval Europe. Let's not forget the props. Some quack dentists went the extra mile and planted worms in people's mouths to prove they were real. One travelling toothman in France claimed he extracted dozens of worms a week. His secret: he kept mealworms hidden in a pouch and would drop them into his patient's mouth right before extraction. Then he'd remove them with tongs and scream, "Behold the demon exits, cue applause." Cue vomiting. Even more hilariously tragic, some people thought the worms sang. Yes, sang. High-pitched wails echoing in your jaw. One chronicler in the 1200s describes hearing the death cry of the toothworm after applying hot pepper to a painful molar. It was probably the nerve dying, or his own screaming. But it made a great story, so it got written down and passed off as science. It gets darker. Some physicians believe the only way to truly kill the toothworm was with red-hot needles. Picture this, a man in a dark stone room holding a glowing iron rod leaning toward your open mouth. No gloves, no anesthesia, just faith fire and absolute dental despair. If you passed out mid-treatment, the healer would assume the worm was resisting. So they'd try again, harder. But wait, there's more. In parts of rural Europe, people actually believed worms could escape and infect others. One boy in Denmark was quarantined because his tooth pain was thought to be contagious through worm migration. You didn't want to be too close when someone sneezed near a toothache. Forget cooties. This was the original oral horror show. Ironically, the idea of toothworms wasn't completely baseless. Microscopic views of infected pulp, if they'd had them, do resemble wriggling threads. And when pus leaked from an abscess, it could congeal into white stringy blobs. To someone who didn't understand microbiology, that absolutely looked like a dead worm. A slimy white horror slithering out of your body. Science hadn't caught up yet, but imagination had sprinted ahead. So why did the idea persist for centuries? Because it gave people an enemy, a reason for their suffering. If your tooth hurt, you weren't just unlucky, you were under attack. It's easier to face pain when you can blame it on something you can kill, or curse, or burn out with garlic smoke and a Latin prayer. It gave control to the powerless. And in medieval Europe, that was rare enough to cling to with bleeding gums. Even medical texts reinforced it. Some scribes illustrated toothworms with as much detail as saints or demons. Pages of manuscript dedicated to tiny beasts writhing in jaws. One scribe even drew a worm playing a flute inside a molar. That wasn't satire. That was belief. And belief is stronger than evidence, especially when evidence involves opening someone's jaw and poking around with a chicken feather. Still, the myth began to die slowly, painfully, much like a molar with untreated decay. By the 1700s, Enlightenment thinkers finally started asking questions. Like, hey, maybe these worms are just the result of not cleaning your mouth for 40 years. But even then, plenty of rural communities kept the legends alive. You can still find folk remedies in Eastern Europe that reference toothworms today. Myths have teeth. And they bite back. Of course, we've replaced toothworms with other monsters. Now it's fluoride conspiracies, essential oil cures, and videos of people brushing their teeth with charcoal, like they're preparing to grill a steak in their mouths. But at least we know the difference between myth and infection. At least we don't pour scalding vinegar into cavities and call it a Tuesday. Next time you feel a twinge in your jaw and reach for a painkiller, remember, someone once believed that same pain was a literal worm nesting behind their incisor, and they burned their mouths trying to smoke it out, and they paid someone to help. You have a dentist. They had a guy with tongs and a worm in his pocket. So yeah, toothaches suck. But they no longer come with bonus hallucinations, medieval smoke rituals, or unexpected larvae. That's what we call progress. And if you feel something squirming in your mouth, maybe just floss more. Or stop reading 13th century French medical texts before bed. Mint. Today, it's everywhere. In your gum, your toothpaste, your overpriced iced lattes. Mint equals freshness. Mint equals confidence. Mint means, hey, I care about the people within a 3-foot radius of my mouth. But in the Middle Ages, mint was something you hammered into coins, not your mouth. The only thing fresh about medieval breath was how bold it was. There were no mints, no Tic Tacs, no peppermint chewing gum. If someone chewed anything, it was a twig, a piece of leather, or a raw herb stuffed between molars as a last-ditch attempt to not gag at your lover's breath. Even then, it wasn't about freshening up. It was about not dying from someone else's mouth bacteria. Romance folks thick with the scent of survival. Let's make one thing crystal clear: medieval people weren't trying to have fresh breath. That wasn't the goal. There was no oral standard to strive for, no minty benchmark. Smelling like decomposing stew was just life. If you had to talk to someone, they just braced themselves. A conversation was basically a duel of halitosis. Whoever flinched first lost. And if you think that's harsh, imagine sharing a bed with someone who hadn't washed their mouth since the reign of King Stephen. Because they hadn't. People didn't even rinse. There was no swish and spit. The closest they got was sloshing warm ale between their teeth, which, let's be honest, probably made it worse. At best you got vinegar. At worst you got wine gone bad and called it a cleanse. There were rumours, little whispers across monasteries and dusty towns that certain herbs might help. Sage, thyme, fennel, parsley. But even then, people weren't using them to freshen breath. They used them to ward off spirits. That's right. Bad breath wasn't seen as socially offensive. It was seen as spiritually vulnerable. If your mouth stank, maybe it was because the devil was living in your throat rent-free. Now picture a medieval feast, jugs of mead, piles of pork, onions sautéed in regret. And across the table, dozens of guests laughing, spitting crumbs and hurling their unwashed breath at each other like biological confetti. You want a gag just thinking about it, don't you, good? That's the correct reaction. You're finally understanding what a non-minty world smells like. To make matters worse, your diet didn't help. You weren't chewing mint leaves after lunch, you were gnawing on salted fish, fermented cabbage, and whatever root vegetable you managed to drag out of the frostbitten ground. Add to that ale, mouldy cheese, and the occasional rotten egg, and you've got yourself a breath cocktail capable of knocking out a mule. No amount of herbal tea was saving you, but surely you protest they had something. Oh yes, charcoal, burnt twigs, a spoonful of ash from last night's fire. All of which were occasionally rubbed on teeth in a moment of desperation. Did it work? Absolutely not. Did it create a fun illusion of effort? Kind of. Until your gums started bleeding and your enamel cried for mercy. And let's not forget the elite, those sugar-huffing nobles with blackened teeth and prideful rot. Did they use mint only if it was pressed into a coin and used to pay someone to chant prayers while they bled from their gums? The rich didn't mask their breath. They weaponized it. Power was the ability to sit at a feast smile with a mouth like a dungeon and still get praised for your fashion. Mint as a concept was foreign, literally. When travellers from the Middle East or India brought up the use of aromatic herbs for breath, Europeans were like, wait, you care what your mouth smells like? The idea was so bizarre it barely registered. You cleaned your mouth only if you were dying, or already dead. Corpses sometimes got a little rinse with wine and herbs before burial. So yes, mint arrived too late. For the living anyway. In medieval medical texts you'll find mouth powders. These were ground-up concoctions of random things, cinnamon, clove, even dried animal parts. They weren't for breath, they were for magic. Sprinkle some on your tongue, chant 3 times, hope your headache goes away. Imagine brushing your teeth with spell dust and calling it hygiene. It was Harry Potter meets halitosis. The only people who remotely prioritised mouth smell were monks, and only because close quarters made their lives unbearable. Some monasteries developed tiny rituals, chewing fennel after meals, rinsing with watered wine, even gently wiping the tongue with linen. It wasn't minty, but it was less offensive. Still, these monks weren't doing it for hygiene. They were doing it because Brother Oswald's breath was killing the prayer circle. Outside the cloister, back to chaos. Midwives, blacksmiths, beggars, bakers, none of them had time or resources to focus on the scent of their mouths. They were too busy staying alive. And if you were lucky enough to be healthy, the last thing on your mind was breath. Besides, everyone smelled. The air was full of dung smoke, sweat and decay. Your mouth was just another chorus in the grand orchestra of medieval stench. But eventually people started to care. It wasn't out of health awareness, it was out of shame. Around the 16th century, nobles began covering their mouths with perfumed cloths. Not because they wanted to smell better, but because the stench of others had finally broken their tolerance. There are records of entire banquets where guests sat with scented rags held to their faces. Think Victorian gas mask, but fancier. From there, the idea of fresh breath was born slowly, awkwardly, and probably while someone gagged on their host's meaty exhale. Still no mint, though. That came much later when explorers stumbled across more fragrant herbs and decided, hey, what if we didn't smell like a goat's undercarriage? And thank whatever gods you believe in for that discovery. Because now you brush your teeth with a swirl of peppermint and bubblegum floss with spearmint thread and gargle with liquid so intense they could sterilize a battlefield. You have the option to smell like a meadow, not like a meat cellar. That's luxury. Next time you pop a mint after lunch or sneak gum before a meeting, remember you're performing a ritual your ancestors would have found completely alien. They wouldn't recognize your toothpaste. They wouldn't understand your obsession with freshness. They'd think your menthol breath was either witchcraft or divine intervention. So chew that gum, suck that mint, and whisper thank you to the timeline that didn't leave you brushing with soot and shame. Let's get one thing straight, the toothbrush did not exist in medieval Europe. Not in the way you know it. No plastic handles, no soft bristles, no sleek design engineered by Scandinavian monks with a dental fetish. If you wanted to clean your teeth, you picked up a stick. Not a fancy stick. Not a sterilized purpose-grown stick, just a stick. From a tree. Any tree. Brush har. That was a word for paint. They were called chew sticks or tooth sticks, and yes, they were as underwhelming as they sound. The technique was simple. Chew the end until it frayed, then jab it into your mouth like you were trying to unclog a drain with a twig. If a few splinters broke off, no big deal. Consider it bonus fibre. People didn't think about hygiene, they thought about rubbing off the pain. And if that pain got worse, well, clearly you weren't chewing hard enough. The most advanced stick users were often monks or travellers who'd seen ideas imported from the East. In Islamic cultures, the miswak, a kind of special twig from the Salvadora persica tree, was used with some understanding of its antibacterial qualities. But did medieval Europeans embrace that no? They saw someone chewing a stick and either copied it badly or called it sorcery. Cultural exchange in Europe was like a game of telephone played underwater. Your average medieval peasant wasn't carrying a miswak in a pouch. They were grabbing whatever branch hadn't been used to beat a goat. Birch, hazel, oak, doesn't matter. They weren't picking for quality, they were picking for proximity. In fact, one surviving record mentions a man using the same stick to clean his teeth and stir his stew. Efficiency, sure. Hygiene, a war crime. But here's the kicker. Even when people did use these sticks, they weren't doing it regularly. Brushing wasn't a morning and night routine. It was more like, my mouth tastes like something died in it, better chew a twig. Or, the bishop is coming and I don't want to be executed for smelling like sin. That was the standard. Clean teeth were a special occasion thing like bathing or using polite words. Some folks went a step further and used ashes or salt rubbed on the stick. Sounds clever, right? Until you remember this is medieval ash we're talking about. Not fancy charcoal powder from Whole Foods. Just whatever fell out of last night's fire mixed with soot. Sometimes dog hair, possibly rat droppings. They didn't check. Why would they? Their mouths were already a garbage disposal unit. Others tried cloth, a rag dipped in vinegar, wine, or animal fat. Rub, rub, gag, repeat. The goal wasn't to be clean, it was to be less disgusting. A nobleman might hand a servant a silk cloth soaked in rosewater to freshen up. But even that was more symbolic than effective. A scented smear over a rotting cave. Think cologne sprayed on a corpse. And let's talk damage. These sticks weren't gentle. They weren't approved by any medieval version of the American Dental Association. They were jagged rough, and occasionally still had bark on them. Chewing too hard could chip your teeth. Rubbing too long could wear down enamel. One monk documented his gums bleeding like a holy river after his morning cleaning. He took it as a sign of spiritual cleansing. We take it as a lawsuit. Children were taught to imitate their parents, so if Dad chewed a stick once a month and called it God Scrubbing Jr. followed suit. But kids had even less impulse control. Some chewed on bones, others on metal. There are records of children losing teeth from trying to clean them with daggers. That's not a metaphor. That's a real child scraping their incisors with a blade like a lunatic squirrel. The idea of brushing for prevention did not exist. People cleaned their teeth reactively when something hurt, when something smelled, or when someone rich enough to judge them walked into the room. Imagine brushing your teeth only when your gums start oozing or your spouse threatens divorce. That's not a hygiene routine. That's a medieval love language. Even the elite were inconsistent. Some royal households kept bundles of herbs wrapped around twigs stored in perfumed cases. Sounds fancy. But were they used? Rarely. They were shown off like you'd display a Peloton bike and never ride it. One French noble had a jewel-encrusted dental wand made of ivory. Historians agree it was purely decorative. Because who wants to jam a precious family heirloom into an infected socket? And then there were the fakes. Snake oil salesmen, sorry healers would travel town to town selling enchanted sticks. Cleanse your mouth of sin. Drive out the tooth demons, used by ancient kings and blessed by saints. One particularly bold vendor sold holy branches dipped in pig blood and rosemary, claiming they had visions of St. Apollonia endorsing them. She's the patron saint of toothaches, by the way. Medieval marketing, it worked, if you shouted loud enough. In some regions, toothsticks were part of folk rituals, chewing a stick while chanting verses to keep your teeth tight in the head. Others used sticks blessed by priests, not because they cleaned better, but because people were terrified their teeth might just fall out randomly. And honestly, they weren't wrong. There are entire skeletons with jaws that look like they were made of Swiss cheese. But eventually people started connecting dots. Some physicians noticed that folks who chewed sticks regularly seemed to have fewer visible rotting holes. That's not a high bar, but it was enough to plant the seed. Maybe rubbing your teeth with something abrasive wasn't completely insane. But real change took centuries. Actual toothbrushes with bristles didn't arrive in Europe until the 17th century, and even then they looked like horse brushes and smelled worse. So here you are today. You've got a toothbrush designed by NASA electric pulses that remind you to floss, and an app that tracks your oral hygiene like it's a workout routine. You brush twice a day with flavoured paste in a sterile bathroom with ambient music and hot water. Medieval peasants cleaned their teeth with fire ash and branches that probably had lice on them. You win. But never forget the stick walked so your brush could run and gag. Think your barber talks too much. At least he's not pulling your teeth between trims. In medieval Europe, your haircut, your amputation, your bloodletting, and your dental extraction all came from the same cheerful guy with a blade and a questionable understanding of anatomy. He was the multitasker of pain, the Swiss Army knife of medieval suffering. No degrees, no licenses, no sterile gloves. Just a smile, a stool and a bucket for the blood. They were called barber surgeons, and they were exactly what the name suggests, part stylist, part street corner butcher. You walked in for a beard trim, and if you mentioned your tooth hurt, he'd say, "Open wide reach for the same forceps he used to castrate goats and get to work." No anesthetic, no sterilization, no gentle countdown. Just hold still and maybe a quick prayer. If you were lucky, he tied you to the chair first. The barbershop wasn't a place of relaxation. It was a place of shrieking. Screams from the back room weren't considered alarming, they were expected. Customers waiting in line barely flinched. It wasn't a spa. It was a battlefield with mirrors. The spinning barber pole red for blood, white for bandages. A literal advertisement for I hurt people professionally. And make no mistake, they were popular. Everyone had teeth. Everyone lost them. Everyone at some point needed someone to rip a screaming molar out of their jaw. And since there were no dentists, barbers stepped up. Stepped up being generous, they saw a business opportunity and leaned in sharp tools first. Who needs training when you've got confidence and an iron hook? Tools of the trade. Think blacksmith shop meets medieval torture chamber. Forceps iron, tongs, levers, chisels, pliers. Some were custom made, most were borrowed from other trades. A tool used to debone a fish in the morning could be yanking a molar by lunchtime, and that same tool might be used later to slice open a boil. It was a day job, not a clean one. And the technique, wiggle wrench and rip. You didn't want precision, you wanted speed. The longer it took, the louder you screamed and the more likely your jaw snapped. Some barbers bragged about extracting teeth in under 10 seconds. Others had signature moves. One barber in Germany was known for yanking molars while humming church hymns. Customers bled out to the soundtrack of salvation. Let's talk hygiene, or more accurately, the violent absence of it. Barbers rarely washed their hands. Blades were wiped on aprons. Blood was mopped with straw or ignored. Infections were not a concern because germs weren't a thing. If your face swelled and your breath turned metallic after an extraction, they called it God's test. If you died well, the barber was always very sorry but not liable. And yet, people lined up. Because pain was normal and options were limited. You could either live with a toothache that felt like the devil himself was tap dancing on your jaw, or take your chances with the man who sharpened his own tools with a whetstone he kept in his sock. It wasn't bravery. It was desperation wrapped in wool. Barber surgeons weren't just tolerated, they were respected. Sort of. They were lower than physicians, but higher than butchers. They formed guilds. They wore aprons, they had symbols. And when they travelled, they brought everything with them. Chairs, straps, buckets, teeth. Yes, some barbers collected the teeth they pulled. For study, for luck, for jewellery. One kept a necklace of molars and called it his crown of pain. We call that trauma. If you think this only happened in tiny villages, think again. Cities had barbers everywhere. London, Paris, Florence. In fact, in some places, barbers were required to provide dental extractions as a public service. Can't afford a doctor? Go to the guy who trims the mayor's beard and hope he doesn't confuse your bicuspid for your earlobe. Even royalty wasn't immune. Kings had royal barbers who doubled as wartime surgeons. During battles, these men stitched wounds, set bones, and yes, pulled teeth in muddy tents with screaming knights. Imagine being in full armour, gut stabbed, and someone yells, "Let's do the tooth now." 'Cause why not? You're already bleeding. May as well finish the job. Barbers sometimes use painkillers if you count strong wine opium or being punched in the face beforehand. One account describes a barber who knocked patients unconscious with a wooden mallet. Not because he was cruel, because it worked. Fewer screams, less movement, higher efficiency. Dentistry by blunt force. And then there were the street performances. That's right, barbers would pull teeth in public squares to advertise their skill. Watch me extract this screaming man's molar in front of a cheering crowd. It was part entertainment, part nightmare. They'd juggle tools, show off infected roots, maybe toss a rotten tooth to a lucky child. Early medieval marketing traumatise your audience, gain their trust. Sometimes they'd bring a monkey. Yes, a monkey, dressed in tiny robes, to dance or hand tools or distract the patient mid-scream. What do you call that? A dental assistant. Honestly, the monkey probably had the cleanest hands in the room. Now let's say you survived your barber visit. Great. You're missing a tooth. Your face is swollen. You're spitting blood. No antibiotics. No gauze. Just the vague hope that the open socket doesn't invite plague flies or Satan. And if it gets infected, back to the barber for more pulling. If you're out of teeth, maybe just an ear next time. Some barbers experimented with replacements. Wooden pegs, animal bone, teeth from dead people. No joke. Grave robbing wasn't uncommon. If your smile mattered, say you were courting someone important, you might pay handsomely for a tooth ripped from a freshly buried stranger. No hygiene, no fit testing. Just jam it in and smile through the sepsis. But here's the wildest part, barbers genuinely thought they were helping. They weren't sadists. They believed in balance. They believed bad teeth leaked poison into your brain. Pulling them was salvation. Their logic was flawed. Their tools were horrifying. But their intentions surprisingly sincere. Pain was proof of healing, blood was cleansing, screaming, just part of the process. Compare that to today. You book a dental appointment online, sit in an air-conditioned room, watch Netflix during a cleaning, get numbed with precision. You leave with a bag of floss and a free toothbrush. You complain when the hygienist scraped too hard. Meanwhile, your medieval ancestor was getting a molar ripped out by a guy named Eustace, who also castrated pigs on weekends. So next time your barber offers you a scalp massage and a free espresso shot, maybe give thanks that he's not also holding a pair of rusted pliers and asking you to bite down on a leather strap. Imagine sitting in a wooden chair, your jaw throbbing, sweat on your brow, and across from you stands a man holding a rusted pair of pliers, grinning like he's about to fix a loose horseshoe. He's not a dentist, he's not even sober, but he's the guy with the tools, and you've got a tooth that feels like Satan's pickaxe is wedged in your skull. There's no escape, there's no anesthesia, just a prayer, a scream, and the plier of doom. Medieval tooth extraction wasn't a medical procedure. It was a test of faith, luck, and pain tolerance. If the tooth was loose, you were lucky. If not, they'd make it loose. The approach was simple: grab, twist, yank. No finesse, just force, like removing a nail from rotten wood, except the wood is your living, screaming face. There was no reclining dental chair, no soft light music, no hygienist with soothing hands and a clipboard. Instead, you got a rough stool, maybe a leather strap to bite on, and the sound of your own heartbeat pounding in your ears as a guy named Ulrich shoved metal into your mouth like he was fixing a wagon wheel. If you cried, it made it harder. If you bled, it meant it was working. The tool's iron tongs, hooks, forceps that looked like medieval salad servers. Some were custom-made, others were repurposed from butchering tools or horseshoeing gear. One recorded dental instrument in France had teeth on the inside of the pliers. That's right, metal teeth for grabbing your teeth. The tool probably worked great for removing bone. And if the tooth broke mid-extraction, that's when the real party started. Broken fragments meant they had to dig, with knives, with awls, with whatever sharp thing was nearby. They'd chip away at your jaw like miners hunting for gold in your gums. Infection was a guarantee. You'd leave with a hole in your mouth and a personality change. One monk wrote in his journal that he had 5 teeth pulled in one sitting. No wine, no mercy, just divine inspiration and a hot needle to the head after. He described the sound as crunching dried leaves in the dark. If you can still eat toast without flinching after that, congratulations, you've officially evolved beyond your ancestors. And what about bleeding? Oh, it bled. A lot. Barbers and tooth pullers often worked over bowls or straw mats because the blood was expected. Some even collected it. Not for scientific study, just because they thought it contained the bad spirits that caused the pain. Bloodletting and tooth pulling were sometimes done together like a discount combo meal from hell. Aftercare. Don't make me laugh. There was no gauze, no antiseptic rinse, no take it easy for 48 hours. You were lucky if someone shoved a piece of linen into the hole and told you not to chew on rocks for a while. Infections weren't just common, they were routine. Swelling fevers and death followed extractions like pigeons follow breadcrumbs, but people kept doing it. Why? Because there were no other options. If you had a toothache, you either lived with it moaning and drooling for weeks or let someone rip it out and hoped it didn't take your soul with it. People lined up at markets and festivals for public tooth pulling. Yes, public. Like street performances, like juggling or fire eating. Except the fire was inside your jaw. One chronicler described a tooth puller named Reinhardt, who travelled with a portable chair, a bag of tools and a large wooden mallet. He'd shout, "Who has pain? Who has pain?" And the crowd would cheer when someone volunteered. The screams were considered entertainment. Think of it like medieval America's Got Talent, but with hemorrhaging and permanent trauma. And don't assume it was just peasants getting this treatment. Nobles did too, just with slightly fancier surroundings and more gold embroidery on their torture chair. If anything, nobles suffered worse because their diets were so sugar-heavy that their mouths were already half decayed before the tool even touched them. One noblewoman had to have 2 teeth pulled during childbirth. At the same time, it was apparently considered efficient. Some practitioners believe that certain teeth were connected to organs. Pull a molar. Your stomach problems might go away. Yank an incisor. You could fix your eyesight. This wasn't dentistry, it was roulette. Your mouth was a game board, and each extraction was a spin of the wheel. Win less pain. Lose blindness, infection, or death. Good luck. And then there were the charlatans. Oh yes. Travelling miracle pullers who promised painless extractions with magic powders. Their technique numbed the mouth with herbs, sneak in a small chisel, then yank when the patient was distracted. One famous fraud was caught yanking healthy teeth from villagers and selling them as tooth charms to nobles. That's not dentistry, that's economic horror fiction. Of course religion made it worse. Everything did. Pain was noble, suffering was holy. A toothache wasn't a medical problem, it was a spiritual test. If the extraction hurt, it meant you were sinful. If it bled, God was cleaning your soul. If it killed you, well, perhaps you weren't meant to be clean. Some priests even blessed the pliers before extraction. Others used the same ones for exorcisms. The line between demon and decay was thin, and speaking of demons, some thought the toothache was one. Literally. Hiding inside your skull, whispering pain into your nerves. That's why some extractions were done with chanting bell ringing or smearing holy water on the patient's lips. Not for sterilization, for demon repellents. Because when in doubt, yell at the problem and hope it goes away. Modern root canals get a bad rap. People whine, dramatize, cry about how painful and scary they are. Newsflash, you're lying in a clean room with anesthesia-numbing gel and a dentist who washes their hands. Meanwhile, your ancestor was having a tooth yanked by a sweaty man in a fur apron who smelled like onions and regret. We romanticize the past. We say things like, life was simpler back then. Yeah, because people died before they could complain too much. You think your dental plan is bad. Your great-great-great-grandfather had a dental plan called Hope and Pliers, and that's assuming he lived long enough to have teeth pulled instead of just letting them rot until they fell out during Mass. So next time you sit in a modern dental chair numbed relaxed watching a tiny TV on the ceiling, while a professional polishes your canines, take a moment. Picture the plier of doom. Picture the man holding it smiling like he's about to gut a fish. Picture yourself gripping the arms of a wooden stool while your mouth becomes a battlefield. Then whisper quietly, "Thank you, dentistry. Thank you for not being medieval anymore." Ah, romance. That timeless human ritual of leaning in close-locking eyes and mashing 2 festering bacterial war zones together in the name of love. Today we worry about morning breath. In the Middle Ages, you worried about catching a disease by kissing someone's infected gums. It wasn't so much kiss of death as kiss of probable dental-related sepsis. Because back then, affection came with a side of infection. Let's be clear. Mouths were disgusting. Not just haven't brushed yet disgusting. I'm talking open sewer attached to your face disgusting. Ulcerated gums, half-dead teeth, oozing abscesses, pus that smelled like fermented garlic. And yes, people still kissed. Courtship rituals didn't stop just because half your mouth looked like a battlefield. Passion has always been stupid. In many places, the kiss was a social formality. Greeting your cousin smooch. Thanking your landlord lip peck. Sealing a truce with a neighbouring village wet disease-filled mouth handshake. Kisses weren't private. They were expected, and they weren't gentle. People kissed like they meant it, because for all they knew, they'd be dead by Thursday. You'd think nobles would have it better. Cleaner, safer, less oozing. Wrong. The higher the status, the more sugar they consumed, which meant the more decay, the more rot, the more opportunity for their saliva to transfer colonies of microscopic horror into someone else's bloodstream. There are records of noble women losing teeth mid-kiss. One fell into her lover's mouth and caused a choking episode. He survived. Their relationship did not. And it wasn't just teeth. Mouth ulcers were common. Sores, boils, and open lesions often covered the gums, lips, and tongue. Cold sores everywhere. But back then they weren't called herpes. They were called blight of the mouth or fire spots, which sounds like a 14th century metal band but is actually just a less scientific way of saying, yes, you now have a highly contagious virus from kissing Lord Edmund and his plague mouth. What about mouthwash, Mouthwash didn't exist. The closest thing was rinsing with wine vinegar or in some cases old urine. That's not a punchline, that's real. Some healers believe that stale urine could sterilise the mouth. Imagine kissing someone who pre-gargled with yesterday's pee and thinking, yes, this is the one. Now we know that dental infections can lead to serious health issues, heart problems, brain abscesses, blood poisoning. In the medieval world, those consequences still happened, but no one knew why. People just died. They blamed witches, or the wind, or melancholic vapours. One man kissed his feverish wife goodbye and died 3 days later from a facial infection. The priest called it divine punishment for kissing a woman during her bleeding moon. Science. And if you got an infection, good luck. Your options were, hope your immune system is feeling ambitious or have someone cauterize the abscess with a red-hot poker. They wouldn't numb you. They'd just hold you down and scream encouraging prayers into your face. One French surgeon in the 1300s recommended slicing the infected area, draining it into a bucket and rubbing it with garlic. Because if you were going to die, at least go out smelling like dinner. But even in this swamp of microbial despair, people still fell in love, still kissed in candlelight, still whispered sweet nothings through half-rotted teeth. That's the part that really messes with your head. The resilience of human affection despite the pus, the rot, the breath that could fell a mule. It's either beautiful or deeply concerning, maybe both. Kisses weren't just about love either. In some religious ceremonies, kissing was part of the rite. Pilgrims kissed sacred relics. Worshippers kissed the feet of saint statues. Kings kissed rings. Soldiers kissed swords. Peasants kissed the hands of nobles. Which means realistically people were swapping bacteria with woodstone and other people's hands all day long. One particularly holy shrine had a line of worshippers waiting to kiss a piece of bone that had reportedly cured syphilis. Ironic considering that many probably got syphilis in that line. Speaking of syphilis, let's talk STDs. Because yes, they existed, and yes, they were often passed mouth to mouth. But people didn't understand disease transmission, so they kept kissing, kept touching, kept blaming witches and miasmas when their tongues turned black and their jaws rotted off. One tragic nobleman wrote in his diary about a cursed kiss that gave him mouth sores and left him drooling blood for 6 weeks. Historians now believe it was syphilitic chancre. He believed it was a love hex. And it wasn't just nobles. Peasants got infected too. The difference. No one wrote poems about their suffering. No one sketched their ulcerated lips in the margins of romantic ballads. They just rotted quietly in their huts, blaming demons and wondering why kissing their spouse suddenly felt like chewing nails dipped in vinegar. In medieval medical texts, you'll find treatments for the kissing disease, though they didn't call it that. They described symptoms: swollen, tongue-open sores, painful chewing, stinking breath. The cures: boil nettles, add honey swish, burn toad skin, inhale, recite Latin prayers while rubbing sheep fat on your chin. Amazingly, none of it worked. The church sometimes stepped in to discourage kissing, but not for health reasons, for moral ones. Passionate kissing was considered sinful, too intimate, too risky for the soul. Ironically, the only thing more dangerous than eternal damnation was the chance of catching trench mouth from your betrothed. But hey, at least the bishops tried. Some lovers adapted. They created proxy kisses, touching foreheads, rubbing noses, or sharing a sip from the same cup instead of swapping spit. It sounds sweet until you realise that cup hadn't been washed in 6 months and had been used by 3 other people that morning. Kissing indirectly was like sharing a toothbrush with a sewer. And children? Oh, they weren't spared either. Mothers kissed their babies. Fathers kissed their sons. If Dad had untreated trench mouth and Mum had cold sores, congratulations. Junior was born into a bacterial baptism. The average child had dental infections before puberty. Some died from them. Others just lost most of their teeth before age 20 and assumed that was normal, because for them it was. So how did this all change slowly, painfully? As idea about hygiene evolved, so did courtship. People began using herbs for breath, rinsing, not kissing strangers with mouth boils. The bar was low, but it existed. By the Renaissance, clean started to mean something. By the Enlightenment, they even knew germs were a thing. And by the 19th century, people were actually turning down kisses if someone's breath was too gnarly. Imagine that standards. And now you won't even kiss someone who forgot to brush this morning. You carry mints, judge breath rate people based on mouthfeel. You have dating apps where photos of white teeth get more swipes than personality traits. You've gone from kiss me, I'm infected, to kiss me, I've flossed and used a fluoride rinse. What a glow up. But maybe next time you lean in for a kiss, you'll think of Sir Geoffrey the Halitoes, whose abscessed lip exploded mid-smooch in 1374. Or Lady Agnes of Rottingdale, who lost 3 teeth to one romantic evening and called it worth it. Or the anonymous peasant couple who kissed one last time before dying of dental plague in a mud hut that smelled like sadness and sheep. And maybe you'll kiss with gratitude. If you strolled into a medieval village and asked for mouthwash, they'd assume you were some kind of wizard. The idea of rinsing your mouth for cleanliness, unthinkable. A clean mouth wasn't just low on the list, it wasn't even on the list. Hygiene in general was a suspicious concept, and oral hygiene was somewhere between folk nonsense and heresy. If anything, the mouth was a battlefield, and the weapons weren't fluoride and floss, they were wine and prayers. Let's start with wine, not the fancy kind you sip on a terrace. This was rough sour and often half fermented, but it had alcohol and alcohol burns, which in the absence of understanding germ theory made it holy fire in a cup. People didn't use wine because they understood antiseptics. They used it because someone once gargled with it, screamed in pain and lived. That counted as science. The logic was simple: if it hurts, it must be working. Rinsing with wine gave your mouth a sting that reminded you of your sins. Red wine was favoured, it looked like blood, and after a few seconds, in a mouthful of sores, it was blood. White wine was too mild. Mead was sticky. Ale was weak. But wine made you feel like you were doing something. Possibly dying, but doing something. Of course, not everyone could afford wine, so poor folk turned to vinegar. Sharp biting and likely to give you ulcers rather than cure them, vinegar was the great equalizer of the peasant mouth. Some healers mixed vinegar with herbs. Thyme, rosemary, even crushed garlic to create cleansing tonics. The results varied from mildly nauseating to burned a hole in my tongue. Still better than doing nothing, probably. Then there were the real believers. The ones who thought cleansing the mouth was a spiritual act. These people prayed while rinsing. Not metaphorically. They literally said prayers while swishing liquids around their decaying gums. The idea was that the mouth, being the source of sin, lying gossiping, cursing, needed both physical and divine purification. So before rinsing, they might say a pater noster. Afterward, they'd spit and whisper Deo gratias as if God himself had approved their spit. Holy water was another favourite. Not because it was effective, but because it made people feel righteous. Rinse your mouth with blessed water, and you weren't just cleaning your teeth, you were cleansing your soul. It didn't matter that the holy water was stored in a stone basin touched by dozens of unwashed hands. Faith kills bacteria right. At least that's what Brother Anselm said before dying of jaw rot. Herbs played a big role too. Not for cleaning per se, but for masking the stench. Mint sage and fennel were chewed or boiled into teas. These weren't rinses so much as desperate perfumes for the mouth. You didn't get rid of the problem. You perfumed the corpse. A noble might chew a sprig of parsley before court. A monk might suck on cloves before confession. It didn't cure anything. It just made your breath smell like a dead garden instead of a dead animal. In some regions, mouth-rinsing rituals took on the air of magical charm. In Wales, a blend of milk and crushed charcoal was swished 3 times under a full moon to ward off the black rot. In parts of Eastern Europe, mothers would have their children rinse with goat's milk while chanting rhymes to keep the tooth spirits happy. These weren't folk customs. They were acts of survival dressed in mythology passed down like whispered recipes for avoiding death by gum. Some recipes from old medical manuscripts border on alchemy. One 13th century English text recommends boiling crushed snail shells with wine and rose petals, straining it, then gargling with the mix for 3 days, but no more lest madness follow. Another suggests rinsing with ox bile mixed with honey to harden the gums and sweeten the breath. The fact that this was considered sweetening should tell you everything you need to know about how medieval mouths normally smelled. Let's pause for a moment and imagine what it felt like to gargle any of these. No numbness, no dentist, just pain raw and intimate behind your lips. You tip your head back, pour in the potion. Maybe it's burning wine, maybe it's garlic vinegar sludge and swish. Every sore erupts in pain. Your cracked molars scream. Your ulcer bubbles. And you say your prayers not because you're devout, but because you genuinely think this might kill you. The rich sometimes employed apothecaries to prepare their rinses. These men mixed powdered coral myrrh, burnt bread alum, and dried mint into water or wine. They were expensive, foul-tasting, and only marginally less likely to poison you than whatever your neighbour made in a cauldron. But hey, it came in a carved wooden flask and had a Latin name so clearly it was medicine. And let's not forget urine. Yes, again, stale urine left out in the sun for a day or two becomes ammoniated. Ammonia is a natural cleaner. The logic followed rinse with old pea and you'll clean your mouth. This was not a peasant thing, it was recommended by physicians. One 14th century Italian doctor swore by his morning rinse, which involved 3 parts urine, 1 part sage oil, and an apology to God. It didn't work. But it did clear a room. Despite all these horrors, no one brushed afterward. There was no follow-up, no toothbrush, no floss. You rinsed, you spit, you moved on with your rotting life. If anything, rinsing was seen as something you did after the pain set in, not to prevent it. Prevention wasn't a thing. Medieval people didn't believe in keeping teeth healthy. They believed in surviving as long as possible before the whole mouth turned black and fell out. Did it help? Maybe a little. The alcohol might have killed some bacteria. The vinegar may have slowed an infection. The herbs smelled nice, but mostly it was the act of doing something that mattered. People didn't rinse because it worked. They rinsed because it gave them the illusion of control in a world full of disease ignorance and bad breath that could curdle milk. And through it all there was hope. Hope that maybe this rinse would stop the bleeding. That this wine was special. That this whispered prayer would make the pain disappear by morning. Hope that if the mouth was clean, the soul might be too. Or at the very least, that the person sitting next to you at supper might not recoil in visible disgust when you opened your mouth to speak. Now we live in an age of antiseptic mouthwash scientifically engineered flavours targeted bacteria-killing enzymes. You rinse and expect results. You swish for 30 seconds and feel minty fresh. You have options: sensitivity relief whitening alcohol-free. You don't say prayers. You don't gargle bile. You don't ask your barber for a bottle of goat's milk blessed by a forest nun. You just rinse and smile. But the next time you tip back your modern mouthwash and feel that tingle of sterile fire on your gums, remember the ones who came before you. The ones who poured wine into open sores, who muttered Latin while foaming at the mouth, who believed that pain and purification were the same thing, who rinsed with vinegar, bled from the gums and called it healing, because they didn't know better. And sometimes even when we do, we still chase that feeling, that swish of something bitter, that hope that it's working, that prayer. To smile in the medieval era was to play a dangerous game. In a world where mouths were rot-riddled caverns and breath carried the stench of death, exposing your teeth, was not a sign of warmth. It was a gamble with your reputation, your rank, and your life. There were no gleaming rows of porcelain-white teeth grinning in candlelight. Instead, there were jagged stumps, blackened molars, and yawning gaps where teeth used to be. A smile could end a conversation, a courtship, or even a career. The danger wasn't just aesthetic, it was political. A nobleman with a twisted grin might be mistaken for a fool. A peasant showing too many teeth could be accused of mocking a lord, and a woman who smiled too freely. She was either mad, a witch, or dangerously lustful. In courtly life, smiles were rare, and when they did appear, they were tight-lipped, controlled, almost pained, like someone holding back a scream. Smiles weren't gestures of joy. They were carefully measured performances of submission or intrigue. Consider the portraits of the aged, sombre eyes, flat expression, sealed lips, no toothy grins. Why? Because smiling showed the truth. And the truth was usually ugly. A monarch couldn't afford to reveal the decaying kingdom inside his mouth. A merchant might lose respect if his teeth suggested poverty. Even jesters, whose job was to provoke laughter, often wore their painted-on smiles as masks to hide the ruined landscape within. The message was simple: keep your mouth shut, literally. But behind closed doors there were whispers about those who smiled too much. There was the tale of a knight who grinned after battle, bloodied, triumphant, and was promptly cursed by a monk who saw his laughter as evidence of pride. Or the baker's wife who smiled too brightly at a customer and was later found drowned in the mill pond, her mouth still open, frozen in that final fatal grin. Smiling wasn't just rude, it was provocative. In a deeply superstitious time, showing your teeth was like baring your soul to the devil. The clergy were especially wary. They preached that the body was a temple and the mouth the gateway to sin. From the pulpit, priests warned of mouths that spewed lies, heresies, and temptations. To smile too broadly was to mock God's suffering. Laughter was not joy, it was a crack in one's spiritual armour, an invitation to the demons who fed on vanity and irreverence. A silent mouth was a pious mouth. A closed mouth was safe. A smiling mouth was asking for trouble. But fear wasn't the only reason people avoided smiling. Pain played its part too. Medieval mouths were battlegrounds. Abscesses throbbed. Cavities rotted unchecked. Gums bled spontaneously. To smile was to stretch already tortured flesh. Every movement of the lips tugged at swollen tissue, every twitch of joy set off a storm of agony. Smiling became an act of endurance, rare, raw, and almost heroic. Or masochistic, depending on who you asked. Among the aristocracy there was a peculiar irony: the wealthier you were, the less likely you were to smile. Why, sugar? The rarest luxury brought from distant lands and sprinkled on everything from meat to bread to wine. Nobles consumed it with pride, but with it came decay. Their teeth turned black, crumbled, and vanished. A prince might have the finest jewels, the most lavish gowns, but open his mouth and ruin the illusion. Better to frown with dignity than smile and betray the rot. This created a strange cultural feedback loop. Artists painted their patrons with grave expressions. Poets praised mysterious beauty over warmth. Philosophers declared that true wisdom came from solemnity, not cheer. Even lovers wrote sonnets to the still mouth and the gaze that speaks what lips must hide. The absence of a smile became a symbol of depth, gravity, nobility. In short, smiling was for fools and children. Adults had suffering to maintain. Still, the smile never disappeared completely. It simply moved into the shadows. In taverns behind tankards of ale, mouths split open with crooked delight. In brothels, clients smiled with the desperation of men grasping for life before it slipped away. On battlefields, dying soldiers sometimes smiled through blood as if mocking death itself. These were smiles stripped of civility, primal, cracked and defiant. They weren't invitations. They were declarations. And then there were the outcasts, the ones who smiled despite everything. The village lunatic, the toothless old woman who cackled at funerals, the boy who lost everything and still played with frogs. Their smiles were seen as omens, not of joy but of madness, resistance, or prophecy. Some feared them, some pitied them, others beat them into silence. A smile in the wrong mouth could unravel the social fabric. Medicine such as it was offered little comfort. There were no dentists offering cosmetic miracles, no braces, no whitening treatments, only extractions and poultices and prayers. If your teeth were gone, your options were limited. Some nobles paid for false teeth made from ivory wood or the teeth of the dead. These were crude, painful, and unstable. They clattered when you ate. They fell out when you sneezed. And God help you if you tried to smile while wearing them. Yet in some circles a strange fashion arose, the controlled grin, a slight upturn of the lips carefully rehearsed, just enough to suggest amusement, never so much as to reveal the chaos within. This was an art form, especially among courtiers and spies. The smile became a weapon, a signal, a mask. Not a reflection of feeling, but a deliberate construction. The kind of smile that said, "I know more than you," or "I might kill you in your sleep." In literature, smiling became coded language. Heroes smiled darkly. Villains grinned with menace. Innocents smiled brightly before being punished by fate. The smile was no longer neutral. It was dangerous. It hinted at plots, seduction, treachery. To smile in a story was to walk a razor's edge. Authors used it sparingly and readers felt a shiver every time it appeared. What were they hiding? What did it mean? Even in death, smiles haunted the living. Corpses sometimes grinned. Rigor mortis could freeze a mouth open, revealing grim rows of finality. Superstitious villagers whispered about death smiles, signs that the soul had gone to hell. Some put stones in the mouths of the dead to keep them closed. Others stitched their lips shut. Better a mute corpse than one that mocked the living with its eternal toothless smile. Today a smile is second nature. A gesture we give freely, sometimes insincerely, sometimes as habit. We pose for photos, flash our teeth, broadcast happiness. But the history lingers in our language. We still talk of false smiles, sinister grins, smile through the pain. Somewhere in our cultural memory the danger remains. The medieval shadows still curl at the edges of our pearly whites, because once upon a time to smile was to take a risk, to open your mouth and let the world see what lived inside. The pain, the hunger, the decay, the madness, and perhaps, just perhaps, the last flicker of joy in a world that did everything it could to crush it. So smile if you dare, but remember what it used to cost. Cheese may seem like a humble comfort today, a soft brie with wine, a wedge of cheddar in your sandwich. But in the medieval world it was something more. It was sustenance, yes, but it was also a secret weapon in the quiet war against tooth rot and starvation. In a time without refrigeration, antiseptics, or the concept of oral hygiene, people clung to whatever edible logic they could muster, and cheese, curiously enough, stood out. Not only did it last longer than milk, it seemed to leave behind a smoother feeling on the teeth, a sensation peasants couldn't name, but they noticed. What they didn't know, of course, is what we now understand about lactic acid, calcium, and casein. These were invisible allies hiding in curds, coating teeth with protective layers, neutralizing acidity after meals heavy in bread and broth. But for the medieval, mouth knowledge wasn't the key, experience was. Cheese felt better than honey. It didn't burn like vinegar. It didn't rot the teeth like fruit soaked in wine. And so across Europe, from Alpine huts to castle kitchens, cheese became more than food. It became ritual. In monastic circles, cheese took on an almost holy dimension. Monks who aged wheels in cool stone cellars might not have known the microbiology at work, but they saw the results. They ate slowly, methodically, with purpose. After prayers, after silence, often after bread so hard it might chip a tooth. And then came the cheese, softening, soothing ceiling. Some monastic orders known for their rigorous diets made sure that cheese always followed acidic meals. They called it balance, nature's way of undoing what man's hunger had disturbed. Among peasants, the relationship was less deliberate, but no less intimate. A shepherd would chew a hard chunk of bread, bite down on a piece of dried mutton, and then finish with goat cheese rubbed in ash and herbs. He didn't know it was helping his enamel, but he did know his teeth ached less when cheese was part of the meal. Children were weaned on cheese and milk. Toothless elders gummed fresh curds in silence by the fire. It was cheap, it was portable, and miracle of miracles, it didn't make things worse. Contrast that with sugar, that seductive, lethal intruder. Imported, rare and deadly, it was the sweet death that only the rich could afford. In contrast, cheese was local, modest and curiously effective. Entire villages might go generations without seeing a single grain of refined sugar, but everyone knew cheese. They stored it in wax, hung it in cloth, buried it in straw. And over time, without knowing why, they preserved not only their food, but their molars. Doctors, or rather the medieval approximation of them, began to notice. A travelling apothecary might remark that villages with more goats and sheep had fewer mouth infections. That certain shepherds could still chew tough meat at 50. That monastery mouths, while by no means glamorous, fared better than those of pastry-loving courts. And though no formal theory was written down, the observation spread. Cheese was good for the humours, soothing to the bile, helpful to the gut and the gums, vague praise, but enough. Some nobles took notice, especially those aging into painful gums and swollen jaws. They couldn't reverse the damage done by sugar-drenched figs or candied walnuts, but they could try to soften the blow. Court kitchens added cheese plates after meals, brie for the French, pecorino for the Italians, hard cheddar for the English, though it was often crumbly and sharp. They might not smile much, but at least their pain dimmed. The cheese didn't cure, it simply coated, and in a world with so little mercy that was enough. The legend of cheese as medicine grew. In one 14th century German manuscript, a healer writes of the white curd that cools the flame of mouth plague. In rural France, midwives recommended soft cheese for teething children not to eat, but to press against the gums. In Eastern Europe, fermented milk products were mixed with herbs to make a kind of poultice applied directly to the jaw for toothaches. And in some places, cheese was even used as a mouthguard of sorts, wedged between molars during sleep to prevent clenching, especially after battles or hard labour. Of course, not all cheese was created equal. Some was too hard, some too spoiled, and the wrong mould could make you sick in ways far worse than dental decay. But generally, aged cheese was safer than milk, easier than meat, and more tooth-friendly than the sour stews that defined medieval diets. It lingered in the mouth just long enough to help, then disappeared without causing more harm, like a quiet guardian in the gloom. In the cities, cheese vendors knew the power of their product. They sold it in rounds and wedges and wheels, sometimes flavoured with garlic or wrapped in leaves. They didn't advertise it as dental protection, but they knew the older buyers returned again and again, the ones who still had enough teeth to enjoy chewing. In markets from Bruges to Florence, toothless men would trade a morning's labour for a sliver of aged bliss, then suck on it for hours like a child with a candy. Not for taste, for relief. The mouth, of course, was not a public topic. People didn't discuss their molars at dinner or compare the state of their gums. But cheese existed in that hush-hush world between pleasure and necessity. It was present at births and funerals, in kitchens and infirmaries, in the satchels of monks and the pockets of beggars. It crossed social classes quietly, uniting them in their shared desire to keep the pain at bay. In this way, cheese became both food and folklore. There are stories, half true, half hoped for, of old widows with perfect teeth who swore by cheese alone. of knights who packed wheels of parmesan into their saddlebags not just for calories, but to keep their mouths from festering during campaigns, of castle servants who stole cheese not for hunger, but because it softened the agony of a broken molar. The superstition took root. Cheese is mercy. Cheese is safety. Cheese is the mouth's friend when the world is cruel, and cruel it was. Most medieval foods were hard, sour, fibrous, or fermented beyond recognition. Bread could be more stone than grain. Dried meat could slice your gums like glass. And wine, though comforting, was acidic enough to melt the edge off a blade. In that battlefield of consumption, cheese was the balm, the retreat, the one thing that didn't fight your mouth on the way in, the one thing that said you've suffered enough. It didn't matter that no one could explain why. It didn't matter that the science was centuries away. What mattered was the result. And generation after generation the lesson passed down, end the meal with cheese. Not because it's elegant, not because it's fashionable, but because something in it loves your teeth more than the rest of the world does. So next time you nibble a wedge of Gouda or a slice of Alpine Gruyère, remember it's not just food. It's armour, it's comfort, it's history. It's a quiet rebellion against the age-old war between food and the human mouth. A war that for once cheese helped us win bite by blessed bite. In the darkened corners of medieval homes tucked behind worn tapestries and creaking wooden cradles, there lingered an odd fear, a quiet dread surrounding the first tiny tooth that broke through a baby's gums. Unlike today's smiling milestones, the arrival of a child's tooth was once cloaked in superstition and whispers. Mothers clutched rosary beads when the gums began to swell. Fathers grew uneasy, praying it wouldn't happen too soon or too late. Because to medieval minds, children's teeth were not just innocent little pearls, they were omens. A baby's tooth was believed to carry power both sacred and sinister. In parts of Eastern Europe, it was said that a tooth appearing before the child could walk was a sign of devilry. In Italy, a tooth that came in early might mark a child as a stregan, a sorcerer. And in remote parts of England, midwives would mutter under their breath if the first tooth arrived before the child's first prayer. For the superstitious, this was not development, it was a curse. A reminder that the body grew with secrets and the mouth was the doorway to things best left unsaid. The fear was old, older than any written record passed down like a recipe you never questioned. In Slavic folklore, a child born with teeth was believed to see spirits, and worse, speak with them. They might wake in the night whispering to shadows. Some families burned the first teeth in the fire, hoping the smoke would carry the curse away. Others buried them beneath stones or trees far from the home, so that evil spirits couldn't follow the scent of the tooth back to the crib. Because if a demon knew where a child's tooth was hidden, it could find the child's soul. Even in more rational courts of medieval Europe, the first tooth stirred unease. There were cases recorded in letters and confessions of noblewomen refusing to nurse children whose teeth erupted before they could speak. A woman in Flanders was said to weep for days after her baby's second tooth appeared because she believed her milk would now spoil. In her mind, the tooth marked the end of innocence. It was a sign the child no longer needed the mother, and worse might turn against her. These weren't medical truths. They were emotional myths, heavy with fear and passed from hand to trembling hand. The church has always had its opinions. Some clerics saw teeth as part of God's design, but others leaned into darker interpretations. The book of Ecclesiastes spoke of grinding teeth as symbols of torment and judgment. Hell was described as a place of weeping and gnashing of teeth. So when a child began teething, especially with pain and fever, it was easy to see it as a test or worse, punishment. Teething pain was often mistaken for possession. Some infants were exorcised, others dunked in icy water not to soothe but to purge. Medicinal remedies didn't help the perception either. To ease teething, healers sometimes rubbed rabbit brains on a baby's gums. or gave them amulets made from the teeth of wolves, an irony lost on no one. In other regions, teeth were painted with ash, or bathed in the blood of a black rooster. The pain was seen as a necessary evil, but the tooth itself, that was the mystery. It came from within, uninvited. It emerged without warning. And for a culture obsessed with signs and symbols, nothing was more unsettling than a change from within the mouth. Some believed the first tooth was a remnant of another life proof that the child had lived before and brought something back. A bishop in Hungary wrote of a child whose first tooth was chipped, and the family believed it was because the child had bitten sin in a past life. Such stories fed the fires of reincarnation myths even in Christian territories. In villages where tales of witches and revenants ran wild, a child with oddly shaped teeth might be labelled cursed, or worse, left in the woods. This was not cruelty, they believed. It was protection. Not all superstitions were grim, however. In parts of Ireland, a child's first tooth was celebrated quietly. If it fell out naturally, the tooth would be placed in a small wooden box and hidden in the walls of the house to bring luck. In some Scandinavian lands, teeth were tossed onto the roof as an offering to ward off lightning. A mother might whisper a rhyme as she threw it. "To the sky with thee, tooth of mine, let no wolf ever shadow my child's spine." In these acts, the tooth became talismanic, an object to be controlled, respected, feared. But even as baby teeth fell and adult ones took their place, the stigma remained. Children with too many teeth, or teeth that came in crooked, were seen as wild, ferocious, untamed. One chronicler described a boy with overlapping canines as a child of the night whose smile hid claws. Another noted that a girl with a double row of lower teeth was believed to be unable to lie a blessing that terrified the neighbours. A child who spoke too early, especially with a full mouth of teeth, was often silenced. Not out of discipline, but superstition. The idea of cursed teeth even extended to death. In some medieval burial rites, children were interred with their teeth removed, especially if they had died before baptism. The belief was that a child's spirit could not rest if the teeth remained, because teeth could bite their way back into the world. In Italy, a ritual known as la bocca chiusa involved sewing the lips shut and placing stones over the mouth to ensure silence. No return, no whisper, no curse, just rest. Some midwives secretly kept the teeth hidden in jars or cloth pouches, not for magic, but for memory, a proof that the child had lived if only briefly, a tiny relic of their suffering. But even these mementos were kept with caution. In times of plague, when children died in dozens, the teeth were sometimes burned in heaps to stop the spread of whatever evil was believed to be passing from child to child. In those flames, grief and superstition danced together in silence, and yet through all this fear, children smiled. Gummy at first, then with crooked milk-white grins, they played in the dirt bit into Apple's lost teeth while wrestling with dogs. And though the adults watched them with wary eyes, part of them also knew this was life. Raw, unpredictable, and breaking through the surface like a tooth in swollen gums. In some places the fear faded over time. Teeth became signs of strength, growth, even beauty. But the old stories lingered tucked in attic boxes and whispered around cradles when the lights dimmed. Because the truth is, the human mouth has always carried more than words. It's carried myths, curses, prayers. And in the fragile, fleeting teeth of children, medieval minds saw not just biology but fate, the hope of survival, the fear of misstep, the unbearable mystery of watching something so small emerge from something so silent, and wondering what else might be coming with it. There is a special kind of suffering that comes from the back of the mouth, a throb behind the molar, deep and persistent, like a drum echoing from a far-off cavern. In medieval Europe, this pain was not attributed to bacteria or decay. No, it was something darker, something alive. A demon they believed had taken residence in your jaw. The agony of a toothache wasn't just physical. It was spiritual, moral, cosmic. A sharp pulsating pain wasn't viewed as random misfortune, it was a consequence. You must have sinned. You must have lied. Perhaps you failed to pray before sleeping. Or worse, perhaps you let an unclean thought fester beneath your tongue, and now a demon had crawled in during the night and made your gum its throne. Stories passed from healer to monk spoke of tiny devils with claws made of bones scraping away at enamel, as punishment for secrets never confessed. One tale from 12th century France tells of a man who dreamed of a serpent coiling in his mouth, hissing with every heartbeat. When he awoke, his face was swollen, and he screamed that the serpent was eating him from the inside. The monks agreed. The only solution was purification not of the tooth, but of the soul. And so the remedies began not with herbs, but with confession. The afflicted would be led to the chapel, made to kneel with wax dripped on their shoulders, a symbolic binding of the demon. Priests whispered prayers directly into their ear, trying to drive the entity out with holy breath. If the pain persisted, it was proof the demon had nested deeper. Some were whipped with willow branches, not as punishment, but to coax the spirit into fleeing. For the truly desperate, there were rituals, half medicine, half magic. One such practice involved boiling vinegar with crushed sage and reciting the Lord's Prayer backward. The mixture was poured onto the aching tooth while chanting, "By mouth I sinned, by fire I cleanse." The pain might subside or it might not. But the ritual was repeated all the same because it wasn't just about healing. It was about reclaiming spiritual order. In village folklore, people sometimes carried demon bones in their pockets, smooth stones, or pieces of animal teeth believed to ward off oral invaders. Children were taught not to speak ill of others at night, lest their tongues attract the tooth spirits. And when someone groaned in pain during supper, it wasn't uncommon for an elder to mutter the devil's nibbling again. It was both a curse and a diagnosis. The toothache had its own grim theatre. Faces swollen like spoiled fruit jaws wrapped in cloth moans escaping between clenched teeth. People wandered the streets hollow-eyed, mumbling prayers or begging for cures. And while some turned to apothecaries for concoctions of myrrh and honey, many more went to charmers, those strange men and women who whispered to bees and brewed potions by moonlight. Their brews often involved ground bat wing river salt and the saliva of a fasting woman. Because demons apparently hated purity, in the north a common belief was that the demon could be scared away by metal. Not just any metal, but hammered silver warmed in a flame and pressed against the cheek. If the skin burned, it meant the spirit was close to the surface. Some even claimed you could hear it shriek. Whether from the pain or the placebo, the method became common among the brave or mad. A particularly disturbing remedy came from parts of Bavaria, where a person with a toothache was told to bite a live frog. The frog, it was said, would absorb the demon through the tongue. Afterward, the frog was thrown into a river without looking back. If the frog lived, the demon had been tricked. If it died, it meant it had been devoured from the inside. No one ever really checked. Some monks believed that the demons favoured certain types of people, the gluttonous, especially those who indulged in meats and sweets, who let the juices of flesh linger in their gums. To them the mouth had become a temple of sin, and the demons were its only proper residents. Fasting was the only cure. For 3 days nothing but water and scripture, as if the soul itself could be starved of impurity. But if nothing worked, if the pain festered and the demon refused to leave, then came the ultimate solution: extraction. A terrifying ordeal, not for the purpose of dental hygiene, but as a kind of exorcism. The tooth was the vessel, and by removing it, one expelled the demon. The victim was made to bite wood or sometimes iron while a helper said prayers. Then came the iron pliers, the pop, the blood, and if they were lucky, silence. Afterward, the extracted tooth was not discarded like today. It was buried. Always outside the village wall, sometimes near crossroads, places where spirits were said to lose their way. A small cross was often carved into the soil to confuse any lingering evil that might try to return. and should the tooth be lost or accidentally burned, it was believed the demon would wander forever, whispering into the ear of the former host. Yet not all demonic toothaches ended with blood. Some were cured or at least quieted by song. A tradition in rural Wales involved singing to the aching side of the face using old lullabies meant for wolves. The vibrations, it was said, soothed the spirit or rocked it to sleep. Old women with no teeth of their own were prize singers. Their voices carried the authority of the pain already endured. In the colder seasons, many simply suffered in silence. They wrapped scarves around their heads, drank warm ale mixed with clove, and rocked before the hearth like pendulums of quiet agony. If they spoke at all, it was to ask for God's mercy, or to curse their youth when they didn't appreciate the quiet of an untroubled jaw. They stared into the flames and imagined the demon shrinking, curling, dying. Modern eyes may see it as ignorance, but in the dark winters of the medieval world where pain had no name and medicine had no answer, stories were survival. If a demon explained the agony, then perhaps a prayer could ease it. If the pain was punishment, then perhaps a lesson could be learned. And if nothing else, if the jaw throbbed and the eyes swelled and the mouth bled, then at least you weren't alone. Others had seen the demon too. The legacy of these beliefs lingers faintly even now. We still speak of tooth demons with a smile. We still clench our jaws when grief comes. We still reach for silver remedies and old songs. And somewhere deep inside, perhaps a shadow of the past remains whispering that pain is never just physical. That somewhere beneath the surface something old and unseen still gnaws. And so the next time your molar hums with a quiet aching throb, you might remember them. The villagers who bit frogs, the monks who fasted, the mothers who burned teeth in secret. You might laugh, perhaps. Or perhaps you'll pause just for a moment and wonder. Not about plaque, not about cavities, but about the invisible guest that once long ago lived inside every medieval mouth. In the medieval night, when fire was not light but necessity, the hearth's glow painted flickering shadows across stone walls. It was by this humble, trembling light that the face met its reflection, not in glass, but in polished metal, still water, or the memory of what one looked like a decade before. There were no mirrors on the wall to whisper truth about the mouth. What lingered beneath the lips remained largely unknown until it began to ache or stink. And so, medieval dental hygiene was not so much hygiene as ritual guesswork and hope, all performed beside a candle's lonely flame. Most people didn't think of the mouth as a separate place that needed special care. It was simply one part of the body like the soles of the feet, or the folds behind the knees cleaned if at all during rare full-body washings. Bathing itself was a seasonal event, not a daily luxury, and brushing the teeth was not a routine but a kind of intimate grooming like combing lice from the scalp or pulling thorns from fingers. Still, there were efforts, some tender, some strange. Pieces of linen were twisted tightly and rubbed along the gums, especially before bedtime. If a person was lucky, they dipped the cloth in saltwater wine or even vinegar warmed by the fire. These moments of oral care were often passed down not by books, but by mothers and grandmothers whispering advice beside the cradle, or during hushed conversations over spinning wheels. Rub with sage, one might say, it keeps the rot at bay. Another might press a sprig of rosemary into a child's hand with instructions to chew. These herbs were not chosen randomly. In an age where science and superstition danced hand in hand, every plant had a mood, a scent, a spiritual signature. Chewing mint wasn't for fresh breath, it was for cooling anger. Rubbing thyme along the teeth that was to keep spirits away. In the castles and great manors, hygiene took on another layer of performance. Noble ladies aware that close company meant close scents might use mixtures of powdered clove or crushed fennel seeds rolled between their fingertips before gently tapping their teeth and gums. This, combined with delicate rinses of rosewater, gave the illusion of care, but it was rarely done consistently. and the results were more ceremonial than effective. Still, there was beauty in it, ritual performed by moonlight, scents of flowers and spice rising with each breath. Even decay in such rooms seemed draped in silk. In the peasant's home, lit only by the breath of a tallow candle, the routine was humbler. A stick from a fruit tree, frayed at one end, served as both toothbrush and chew toy. Children gnawed on apple twigs as they sat before the fire, their mouths sticky with porridge. No one told them they were cleaning their teeth, but the habit lingered, passed down like an heirloom. By accident or ancient instinct, they were doing something good. And sometimes, just sometimes, their smiles outlasted those of kings. But whatever form it took, cleaning the teeth in the Middle Ages was always physical. There were no invisible enemies, no discussions of bacteria. Decay had weight and smell and colour. It was something you could feel with your tongue, not something you feared under a microscope. If your teeth felt smooth, that was good. If they felt jagged or hot, that was bad. Grit was common, pain was tolerated, and the idea of prevention was largely foreign. People reacted, they didn't prepare. Nighttime especially became the natural moment for oral care, not because it was the best time, but because it was the only time. The village day was hard, fast and loud, but after the animals were fed, the doors latched, and the children nestled in hay beds, there was finally a breath. In this breath, one might pluck a wisp of nettle or rub ash against a molar just to see if it helped. There was a kind of intimacy in it, like whispering to oneself through touch. It was not medical, it was ritual, half asleep and half remembered. Apothecaries sold tooth powders, rough mixes of charcoal-powdered bone salt and crushed herbs. They came in tiny leather pouches sealed with wax or bound in cloth. To use them, one dipped a damp finger or linen cloth into the powder and rubbed it along the teeth. Some burned, some stank. But in a world where health was often felt in the gut and tasted in the mouth, these powders became precious. They were kept near candles on the shelf with oil and onions just within reach during the quiet hour. By candlelight shadows made every gesture feel like magic. The act of reaching into one's own mouth with a cloth, a twig or a pinch of ash, became a strange theatre of self-awareness. Teeth bared like beasts in the fire's glow, breath escaping like ghosts. A woman might close her eyes and whisper a small prayer to Saint Apollonia, the patron saint of toothaches, before touching her gums. A man might blow on his palm, sniff it, and wince, and sometimes they would say nothing, just clean in silence. Because talking about the mouth meant talking about the body, and the body, especially in pain, was a reminder of death. Some monastic orders were stricter. In abbeys where silence was sacred, monks maintained a level of personal cleanliness that bordered on reverence. They brushed teeth with willow bark or chewed cardamom seeds after meals. Hygiene was a form of humility, caring for the vessel that carried the soul. In the flickering light of a chapel corridor, one might see a figure bent in prayer, mouth, moving not in recitation but in soft scraping. A monastic brushing, slow and careful as if each tooth were a rosary bead. Children learn these customs not from doctrine, but from watching. They saw their parents rinse with warm wine before bed. They mimic the motion of rubbing gums with fingers. They held their mouths open as mothers check for sores or bleeding. And in the dark they learned what every medieval person knew: if your teeth failed, your voice failed. Your appetite dimmed. Your smile vanished. So you learned to guard it in small ways with whatever light you had. Of course, not everyone cared. Many simply let their mouths decay, believing it was God's will. If a tooth turned black, they prayed harder. If it fell out, they thanked heaven for the relief. But even those who dismissed oral care often still performed some gesture, a wash, a chew, a rub. Because in the flickering dark, superstition filled every silence. And if a demon could live in your molar, as some believed, it made sense to scrub the gate where it entered. The candle was both witness and partner. It gave just enough light to see the edge of a lip, the gleam of a tooth, the blood that sometimes came after. But it never revealed too much. Perhaps that was a mercy. In a world of hidden rot, the candle offered only suggestion. And in that half-lit realm, oral care became a private ritual, a quiet, smoky choreography between pain and prevention, shame and pride. And so dental hygiene in the medieval world was not a science. It was a habit, a hope, a nightly act of defiance against decay, done by hearthlight, by oil lamp, by moonbeam through wooden slats, done alone in silence with fingers, sticks, powders, prayers, not because it worked, but because it was all they had. And in that dim room, in the flicker of flame, that was enough. The medieval mouth did not sleep peacefully. As candlelight faded and hearths turned to ash, the residue of the day's meals, grains, roots, meat and ale, curled between crooked teeth, like ghosts settling in for the night. Most had no idea what clung behind their lips after supper, but some, guided by inherited instinct or whispered lore, reached for a pinch of charcoal. Blackened wood burnt to ash and powdered fine became the dream of a cleaner smile, a fragment of ancient fire repurposed to scrub away sin. Charcoal was both blessing and brute. It scoured, it scratched, it left behind a bitterness that clung to the back of the tongue, but it worked at least more than nothing. The fine grit, though abrasive, rubbed away the visible layer of filth, turning yellow to a kind of mottled grey-white. When rubbed onto teeth with a linen cloth or a frayed stick, it polished with a crude sincerity. There was no pleasure in it, but there was a strange dry satisfaction. Yet not all dreams were made of coal. Some were carved from nightmare lime, the kind that burned. Lime was not squeezed from fruit, but slaked in pits, a pale caustic powder scraped from kilns and mixed with crushed bones or ash. In tiny amounts it was thought to harden the teeth or whiten them. In larger amounts it seared flesh-stripped enamel and left the gums bleeding like cracked leather. People used it anyway, because the pain was proof that something was happening. To apply lime to the mouth was to gamble with fire wearing a powdered face. Some mixed it with vinegar, believing the sour wine would tame its bite. Others combined it with crushed fennel seeds, masking the bitterness with licorice-like sweetness. A brave few even added honey not for taste, but in the desperate hope that sweetness would calm the burn. It didn't, but at least the suffering came with a pleasant smell. Such mixtures were whispered in corners and copied from herbal manuscripts whose authors hadn't tested their own recipes. The combination of lime and charcoal, often in the same preparation, became a paradox of medieval oral care, a gritty substance meant to clean, and a burning one meant to cure. Together they told the story of an age that feared rot but lacked the tools to prevent it. A merchant might keep a small pouch of the mixture in his satchel, pressing it into his gums before meeting clients. A lady might apply it in secret before a feast, hoping for a cleaner smile beneath her veil. And a priest, fearing both bodily decay and spiritual ruin, might endure the sting as penance. These substances had texture, gritty, silty between the fingers. They left the tongue feeling foreign like a slab of rough linen. There was no foaming, no minty aftermath, just a taste of scorched earth and sour stone. And when the blood came, as it often did, people took it as a sign the mouth was purging something evil. They didn't worry about enamel. They didn't know what enamel was. They only knew what pain meant something was being driven out. Children were sometimes forced into these rituals, their mouths held open by impatient hands. They cried. They gagged. They swore never to let the black powder or white sting touch them again. But come the next festering ache, they opened wide once more, because the alternative, letting the tooth rot until it cracked, was worse. And somewhere between the scream and the silence, they learned the logic of their time, better to suffer by choice than by surprise. In the wealthier homes, ingredients were stored in tiny pots with tight lids, some carved from horn or bone. A pot of tooth powder could sit beside rosemary oil, sage leaves, and chunks of beeswax used for balms. But no matter how fine the vessel, the content still came from soot and stone. One noblewoman's recipe copied into a monastery ledger included crushed oyster shells, ground deer antler and a pinch of lime with instruction to rub gently, lest the teeth crumble. Crumble. The word wasn't metaphor, it was warning. Even the apothecaries, the chemists of their time, struggled with the line between cure and corrosion. A respected seller might recommend powdered pumice for cleaning mixed with burnt eggshells and a touch of honey. Another might swear by coral dust soaked in goat's milk. They sounded poetic, almost beautiful, but they shared the same flaw. They scraped, they scorched, and they offered no mercy. In many cases, the goal was not cleanliness, but spectacle whiter teeth at any cost, especially in public view. The church remained suspicious of vanity. Priests cautioned against excessive attention to appearance, branding it prideful, even sinful. Yet in private, even some clergy practiced secret ablutions. After all, confession came by mouth. A foul stench might offend both man and heaven. One bishop's diary lamented his souring gums and praised a charcoal-lime mixture gifted by a Moorish trader. He used it every fortnight, and the diary noted, "My prayer breath no longer offends." That was praise medieval style. Lime was also used in burial practices, dusted on corpses to prevent the stink of death from spreading. That the same substance went into living mouths says much about the medieval comfort with contradiction. What preserved the dead might in small trembling doses preserve the living at least until it didn't. And if gums receded or teeth cracked or roots blackened, well, there was always St. Apollonia, and pliers, and prayer. Some swore off the powders, completely choosing instead to chew herbs until their jaws ached. Parsley clove or even pine resin found their way into mouths as makeshift fresheners. It was less painful if less effective. But for many the choice came down to tolerance. If they could handle the grit and sting, the powders promised some relief, however temporary. If not, they accepted the rot with stoic silence. Not everyone had dreams of cleaner mouths. Many had only nightmares of the pain to come. Charcoal carried other meanings too. In some regions it was rubbed on the teeth before battle, darkening the smile into something fearsome. Vikings may have blackened their teeth to appear more terrifying. Soldiers across Europe reportedly did the same before sieges. The line between health and intimidation was thin, and charcoal already present in the home became a tool for both. In this way, even dental care became an act of performance, another mask worn in a brutal world. The stories lasted longer than the teeth. A grandmother might warn against too much powder, recalling a cousin whose smile shattered like ice. A travelling bard might sing of a lord who kissed a lady and passed her a mouthful of sores. These weren't lessons. They were folklore stitched into daily life like lace into cuffs. And between the songs and sighs, people learned how far they would go for a cleaner breath or a prettier grin. As with many things in the Middle Ages, it wasn't just about function. It was about faith. Charcoal purified, lime punished. Together they symbolized the dual nature of the body, capable of beauty, destined for decay. To rub them on the teeth was to say, I am trying. Not to be clean necessarily, but to be less unclean. In a world of filth and fire, that was often the best one could do. And so as sleep took the village and the fires dwindled low somewhere in the darkness, a hand reached into a pouch. A thumb dipped into a black powder. A cloth was drawn across aching gums. Somewhere someone whispered a curse or a prayer and felt the bitter sting of lime kiss their lip. They grimaced, they spit, and they waited, hoping tomorrow's breath would come easier. It was said only half in jest that a peasant's breath could kill a chicken. Not instantly, but slowly through prolonged exposure. A hen that wandered too close to a snoring mouth might stagger, flap and fall dead by dawn. The villagers laughed, but not too loudly. They had all smelled it. Thick as cellar mould, sour like fermented milk, hot as the inside of a smithy's glove. Morning breath in the Middle Ages wasn't a private nuisance, it was public warfare. The stench came from more than rotting food. It was decay, yes, but layered with blood bile. and the memory of every meal left festering between crooked molars. And there were many, few brushed, none flossed. Mouths were left to marinate overnight ripe with beer, residue onion broth or curdled cheese. By morning some exhalations could strip the varnish from a chapel pew if such varnish had existed. People turned their heads, offered greeting through fingers, and stood upwind by instinct. In cramped cottages where 10 shared a straw mattress and no one had ever heard of a toothbrush breath mingled like ghosts. A baby's first memory might have been its father yawning in the dark. Husbands turned from wives. Priests turned from confessions. Even dogs, loyal and unbothered by filth, sometimes slunk away from their masters' morning faces. Breath was more than foul, it was feared. Not for its social consequences, but for its health. Because halitosis, though not named, was considered dangerous. In some beliefs, bad breath was thought to poison the very air. A mouth that smelled of rot might carry illness on its vapour. One physician from Bologna wrote in 1293 that a diseased breath may foul the humours of another like mildew spoiling bread. Some medieval doctors even advised covering the mouth when speaking, not to be polite, but to protect the listener from invisible sickness. In plague times, breath became a weapon, not just from coughs, but from conversation. People feared what might pass between lips, even in whispers. Some wore sachets of lavender or rosemary around their necks to clean the air, and they often bit down on cloves while speaking to others. The noble elite chewed cardamom or myrrh before meetings, but these were masks, not cures. Beneath the spice and sweetness, the rot remained waiting to rise like steam from boiling soup. Barbers and bath attendants spoke of customers whose breath could cloud a mirror. One such tale told of a knight who leaned too close during a shave, fogging the razor blade. The apprentice gagged and dropped his comb into the basin. The knight apologised but explained, the priest said, "It's the devil fleeing my soul." That was often how people explained it, not as biology but as moral stain. Bad breath could be a sign of gluttony, sloth, or even secret sin. Still efforts were made. Peasants chewed on mint leaves if they could find them, or wild thyme scraped from sunlit rocks. Sage was boiled into mouth rinses when available, though it stung if the gums were bleeding. Some favoured marjoram steeped in vinegar. Others just swished wine around their teeth and spat onto the ground, believing it would draw out the death. It rarely helped. The wine, sour and warm from storage, merely added a fermented note to an already pungent melody. Even saints were not immune. In one hagiography, a revered monk was described as having the breath of sanctity and sulphur. The faithful believed it was because of his extreme fasting his stomach emptied his mouth, a furnace of fasting breath. Yet pilgrims still kissed his hand, holding their own breath, tears in their eyes from both reverence and aroma. In this way, even stench became spiritual, a sign of sacrifice. Holiness had a scent, and it wasn't roses. The truly desperate turned to burning remedies. Dried orange peel was roasted over coals, then chewed. Birch bark was scorched, ground to dust, and rubbed on the tongue. In some towns, people believed blowing warm smoke into the mouth would chase out the stale spirits that caused foul breath. They would inhale from burning herbs, then cough violently into a cloth watching for blackened mucus. If it was dark, they rejoiced, the demon is leaving. If it wasn't, they blamed a witch. The superstition extended to livestock. Farmers whispered that a cow could sour if breathed on by a man with a bad tooth. Chickens might stop laying. A goat might birth a runt. In a world where survival depended on animals, foul breath became not just an embarrassment, but a threat to the household economy. Some even sent their worst-breathed relative to sleep in the barn so the cows might keep their milk. Whether it worked didn't matter. What mattered was belief. Children learned to avoid morning breath like fire. They ducked under arms, held their breath during sermons, and offered dried flowers to elders without being asked. One boy in Flanders became a village joke when he fainted during Mass. The priest had leaned too close. The child's mother insisted he was merely hungry. But neighbours whispered he smelled the father's confession. Such stories lingered like the odour itself. They were passed on mouth to mouth. The upper class had their own solutions. Some rinsed with rosewater and wine. Others imported sugarloaf pastilles from the East-pressed lozenges scented with musk or clove. They were rare, expensive, and prized like relics. A lady might keep one beneath her tongue during courtship, only revealing it when the man leaned in too close. What sweetness, he might say, unaware of the rot that lurked beneath the perfume. Thus courtship became camouflage. But no one, not even kings, could fully escape the problem. One chronicler wrote of a lord who avoided conversation entirely in the morning, fearing that his breath might taint the alliance. Another described a queen whose chambers reeked of violet oil, not from vanity but necessity. Her attendants burned herbs constantly, wafting smoke beneath her canopy bed to mask the stench. Behind every silk curtain was a secret war against the mouth, and when someone died, especially in the middle of the night, their breath was studied. She died of the lung vapour, someone might whisper, or a spirit left through a poisoned tongue. Death breath, as it was called, was feared as a kind of ghost, invisible, lingering, and possibly contagious. Bodies were sometimes buried quickly, not to honour the dead, but to silence the breath that lingered. Funerals were short. Incense was thick, and everyone stood back. There were rare cases, miracles, even of people whose breath was sweet. A nun in Germany was said to smell of honey while she prayed. Another in Italy emitted the scent of lilies as she died. These were not dental victories, but divine mysteries. Such cases were studied by monks and scribes, written into texts with gilded letters. But for the average villager, sweet breath remained a fantasy like clean hands or warm winters. Ultimately, breath in the Middle Ages was both metaphor and menace. It was the whisper of health or the growl of decay. It revealed hunger, disease, and sometimes despair. Lovers braved it. Enemies weaponized it. And the rest just endured. To speak was to expose. To kiss was to gamble. And to yawn was to risk becoming a village joke or an accidental poultry assassin. So yes, your breath could kill a chicken. And if it didn't, it might still clear a tavern faster than a spilled chamber pot. It was a medieval truth. What left your mouth was as feared as what entered it. And in that dark, damp world of wood smoke and sweat, the breath you carried said more about you than your words ever could. To suffer was to be holy. That was the prevailing wisdom, if you could call it that, when it came to pain in the Middle Ages. From aching joints to bleeding gums, discomfort was believed to purify the soul, chisel away sin, and bring one closer to God. Tooth pain in particular held a strange status. It was not merely tolerated, it was at times welcomed. Because what better sign that you were alive and worthy of penance than a stabbing reminder in your own jaw? Some monks saw it as a divine test. They whispered prayers through clenched teeth, refusing even to touch the swelling, lest they interrupt their own spiritual cleansing. One cloistered brother reportedly went 3 winters with an abscess the size of a plum, claiming each pulse of pain was a kiss from Christ. His face bulged like dough left to rise too long, and yet he smiled crookedly. To modern minds it was lunacy, but in his world, pain meant progress. Layfolk followed suit in their own less poetic way. Villagers would clench their teeth and mutter, "It's the Lord's punishment. Let it be." The more devout might fast believing food was too worldly for a mouth cursed by divine wrath. Others tied holy charms around their heads, hoping to channel the pain into piety. One woman in Normandy even tied a scapula to her chin, letting it dangle into her soup. She claimed her agony was a warning not to enjoy the taste of life too much. And there were those who went further. They praised the pain. A bishop in Toulouse famously called his molar agony the song of the soul's awakening. His servant said he refused any treatment, even herbs, saying, "Why hush a message sent by heaven?" His jaw eventually locked, his face swelled, and he died in mid-prayer, his mouth still open in what the scribes called a silent hymn. His followers didn't pity him. They envied him. This belief didn't come from nowhere. Medieval theology was steeped in suffering. Christ's passion was the ultimate model. Saints were revered for their torments burned, broken, bled. So what was a little toothache by comparison? Some preachers even urged their flock to accept dental pain as a chance to participate in Christ's trials. Let the rot enter, one sermon declared. Let it fester. For from the decay of the flesh rises the purity of the soul. It's no surprise then that cures were viewed with suspicion. If God gave the pain, who were you to take it away? The idea of offering up one's toothache became common, a sort of medieval bargain. Suffer now and perhaps your afterlife would smell less of sulphur. Children were told, don't cry for the pain, thank him for noticing you. A child in Bavaria was praised for enduring a tooth infection for 2 years. When he died, they said his soul had no need of purgatory. Yet not everyone endured so willingly. Some gritted their teeth in frustration, literally. A blacksmith in Kent was said to have yanked his own tooth with hot pincers, declaring, "If God wants me to suffer, he'll have to find another way." His wife was horrified. The village priest excommunicated him for a month, but secretly others admired his defiance. The pain, they said, was holy, but it was still pain, and it wasn't just spiritual. People believed tooth pain cleansed the body too. They thought it drew sickness from the organs, pulling poisons from the stomach or liver through the mouth. One French herbalist wrote, "The pain of a tooth does pull forth the bile of sin, both mortal and physical. So the worse it hurt, the more toxins it must be removing." In this sense, toothaches became a form of primitive detox, a bloody agonizing one. This belief led to disturbing practices. Some would intentionally agitate a sore tooth to release more poison. A common technique involved chewing rough bread or ash-covered bark. Others tapped their own teeth with small hammers, hoping to awaken the healing spirits. In Germany, a belief spread that sucking on a rusty nail would accelerate the holy suffering. Entire families passed down pain rituals, turning dental misery into generational penance. There was also the legend of the blessed ache. In parts of Italy, people believed that those who died with an aching tooth would have a special place in heaven. Their mouth was never satisfied, they said so their soul will be. A shrine in southern Tuscany even featured a relic, a tooth with a black root said to belong to a weeping saint who died mid-howl. Pilgrims came to kiss it, praying for a taste of her sacred agony. In some monasteries, monks took vows of silence, not only in speech, but in pain. They would not cry out even when their molars cracked or their gums bled in the cold. They viewed each stab as a meditation. It was a way to listen to God through the nerves. One monk reportedly said the soul cannot hear God unless the mouth is humbled, and a humbled mouth was often a broken one. Of course, not all pain was divine. Some believed toothaches were sent by devils to tempt a man into blasphemy. If a bellow of pain escaped, it was seen as the demon winning a point. People tied bells around their necks to keep themselves from cursing aloud. A child with severe tooth pain was sometimes watched closely lest he speak in tongues and be accused of possession. The line between holiness and heresy was as always razor thin. Still, the idea that pain was a gift endured. Even in courts, noblemen were mocked if they complained too loudly about tooth problems. A count in Aragon was once laughed out of a feast when he brought a pillow to bite during meals. His enemies joked, "He has no teeth for meat, only for moaning." The church didn't defend him. They agreed true faith bears pain without a sound, and yet whispered behind monastery walls and tavern doors were the quiet rebels, the ones who sought relief. They used crushed herbs, drank moon wine, or secretly visited the barber's chair. But when asked, they denied it. They clutched their swollen jaws and murmured, "I welcome this pain." Because to admit the truth that they hated it, feared it, and longed for it to end was to admit they lacked faith. And in a world where suffering was currency, that was a form of poverty. Perhaps the strangest legacy of this belief was the way it shaped memory. Children remembered their parents not just by their laughter or their work, but by the sounds they made at night, groans behind the curtain, quiet whimpers by the hearth. Tooth pain was part of life's soundtrack. And when those same children grew up and felt the first throb in their own jaw, they didn't run. They sat quietly watching the fire and whispered the same old line, "It is good to suffer." So they thought tooth pain was good, not because it helped them live, but because it helped them die a little more devoutly. It humbled, it punished, it bled them without killing them. And in a world where the next life was more important than this one that made it holy, a rotten tooth wasn't just a medical issue, it was a spiritual calling. One aching molar at a time, they chewed their way to heaven. If you brushed your teeth this morning with a soft-bristled tool and a tube that smelled vaguely of peppermint and modernity, you should count yourself among the blessed. For centuries such a ritual would have been foreign, laughable, or even considered suspicious. The idea of scrubbing one's teeth daily on purpose with a concoction of gentle abrasives and antiseptics is barely more than 2 centuries old. And for most of human history, anything you smeared on your teeth was far more likely to harm than help. The ancient world had its powders, sure, but by the Middle Ages the art of cleaning the mouth had devolved into a strange combination of grit, superstition, and desperation. Toothpaste as we know it simply did not exist. What did exist were rudimentary pastes or powders made from ingredients that read like a witch's pantry. Crushed bones, ashes of burnt bread, powdered brick and charcoal were all fair game. Add in a pinch of salt or the ground shell of a snail for polish, and you had yourself a medieval mouth-cleaning mixture. The texture was rough, the taste horrifying, and the long-term results often worse than doing nothing at all. But people used them anyway because the alternative was rotting silently. And while cleaning the teeth was rare, it wasn't entirely unheard of. Nobles might employ apothecaries to prepare special tooth powders, often laced with mint leaves, dried herbs, or myrrh, though these were more for breath than actual hygiene. Some even used crushed pearls or alabaster powder in the absurd belief that their whiteness could transfer to the teeth. Needless to say, it did not. These rituals were symbolic more than functional social performance masquerading as care. Meanwhile, the lower classes chewed twigs and hoped for the best. Even as late as the 18th century, before modern dentistry took root, dentifrices came in tins and jars that promised whiteness, freshness and strength, but were laced with acids and abrasives. Some contained hydrochloric acid, which stripped the enamel clean off. Others used burnt alum, which dried the mouth into a desert. The mouth might feel clean for a moment, but decay had already moved in. The enamel, that fragile guardian of the tooth, was often the first victim of these overzealous brews. The earliest modern toothpaste didn't arrive until the mid-1800s. Before that, a brushing implement itself was a luxury and often just a rag wrapped around a finger. When brushes did come into fashion, they were made with boar bristles, hard, stiff, and prone to rotting if not dried properly. No one worried about bristle softness or ergonomic grips. If it scraped, it cleaned, or so they believed. Gums bled, enamel wore down, but at least something was being done. The real game changer came with fluoride and with science. It wasn't until the 20th century that researchers realized fluoride could actually strengthen enamel and reverse early decay. Before that, the idea that a paste could heal rather than just scrub was revolutionary. Suddenly, toothpaste became more than a gritty afterthought. It became a daily ritual, a quiet battle waged each morning and night, with armies of minty foam marching against bacterial hordes. And best of all, it tasted pleasant. Today's toothpaste comes in hundreds of varieties. Anti-cavity, anti-sensitivity, anti-aging even. There's charcoal for trend chasers, baking soda for purists, and all-natural options for the wary. We debate whether to rinse afterward or not. We compare fluoride levels like wine vintages. All this would be sheer fantasy to a 14th century peasant picking ash out of their molar with a splintered twig. They would have looked at your bathroom shelf like a wizard's altar, so many potions, so many promises, and yet we complain. We groan about brushing as though it were a chore rather than a modern miracle. 2 minutes twice a day seems unbearable compared to hours of pain in the old world. We sigh at flossing, roll our eyes at dental visits, and treat the act of brushing as something between boredom and burden. But perhaps we've forgotten what came before the stench, the ache, the blood on the pillow. Toothpaste is not just a cosmetic convenience. It is civilization in a tube. So be grateful for that streak of blue and white, that swirl of gel on your brush. It is the culmination of centuries of suffering, of mistakes, of mouths ruined in ignorance. It is clean breath, strong enamel, and the absence of worms, literal and figurative. It is science triumphing over rot. And it is proof in some small foamy way that not all human history is doomed to repeat itself.